That's intelligent design.
This is just normal physics.
It's a reasonable conclusion to believe that the universe had a beginning.
Two notions of the Big Bang are getting confused.
The fact of fine-tuning is something that's on the table. It's been established by leading physicists.
But it hasn't been established. This is something that's been disputed. This is the whole point.
All right, well, let's go there.
Any argument predicated on a beginning is going to create difficulties for a materialistic worldview.
We don't know what's going on in the early universe. What experimental evidence does the God theory make?
Fine-tuning or information density, these are things we know from experience come from minds.
Can we get a chance to reply?
You keep accusing me of interrupting you.
Okay. Let's.
A number of parameters fall within very narrow ranges, outside of which life and even stable galaxies and even basic chemistry would be impossible.
Do we know how many sides there are on the dice? No, we don't. Right? We don't know how many values are actually possible.
The solution to the fine-tuning that's given is the concept of the multiverse. I mean, maybe I could have a go at it.
Give us both a break here. Yeah.
Well, I think it's better for me to reveal not what I think, but what physicists think. So why don't I reveal what the results are?
You've come prepared.
I've come prepared.
I'm sorry, Phil. That's a kind of dodge.
I think Steve has just got confused here, right?
We've been going, for the best part of 3 hours at this point.
I think this is the toughest debate I've ever had.
You're very good too, and it's fun, right?
Yeah, it's fun. It is fun, right?
Hello and welcome to another edition of Uncommon Ground with me, Justin Brierley. Absolutely delighted to be joined today by Steve Meyer and Phil Halper to talk about the universe and God. Great quote that Steve reminded me of today from Bob Dylan, who said, "You can't criticize what you don't understand." And that is really a good encapsulation of this show. We do have our differences and we're going to be debating them today, but we're also going to be trying our best to understand each other, where we're coming from. That's the point of Uncommon Ground. So let me introduce my guest. Stephen Meyer is a philosopher of science who received his PhD from the University of Cambridge. A former geophysicist and college professor, he now directs Discovery Institute's Center for Science and Culture in Seattle. He's a well-known proponent of intelligent design. His most recent book, Return of the God Hypothesis, argues that 3 major scientific discoveries in recent decades have revived the idea that there is a mind behind the universe. Phil Halper is a fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society, former journalist in residence at the Penn State Institute for Gravitation and the Cosmos, and author of the new book Battle of the Big Bang with cosmologist Niayesh Afshordi. And he's also the creator of a number of popular YouTube videos, a series called Before the Big Bang, featuring loads of leading cosmologists. His book and video series, which has had millions of views, push back essentially on claims that modern cosmology points to God. So this is going to be a really interesting conversation. Steve and Phil, thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Justin.
Thanks
it's
for
an
having
honour
us
to
on.
be here. I'm really looking forward to our
Well,
conversation.
wonderful to have you both here. The fun of doing it in a place like Yarnton Manor, a beautiful place like this, is we have the time and the leisure, if you like, to get to know each other a bit and to hopefully have a really interesting conversation in the process. But where, as I say, we try and do this thing where we also understand each other as best we can. We'll come to that in a moment. Why don't we start with a bit of background to you both? Steve, how did you get into science, the philosophy of science, and ultimately writing about these big scientific discoveries?
Well, for me, there was a kind of a turning point conference that I attended when I was early in my career. I was working as a geophysicist, doing seismic data processing for an oil company. And a conference came to the city where I was working that was exploring the very kinds of questions we're going to talk about today, and looking at the origin of the universe, the fine-tuning of the universe, and the origin of life, those 3 big questions. And I was kind of surprised in listening to the back and forth. There were panels with scientists who had a more materialistic worldview and those who had a more theistic worldview. And it seemed to me, sort of coming off the street, as it were, that the theists had the intellectual initiative in the discussion. I was kind of fascinated. One of the scientists that I then met at the conference had just written a book, an important book about the origin of the first life, called The Mystery of Life's Origin. And he happened to live in the city where I was working. I started to join him after work hours for long discussions about different models of the origin of life. And I ended up a year later off to Cambridge to do what I thought would be a 1-year master's course in the history and philosophy of science. I did my master's thesis on the history of origin of life research, and then I ended up segueing into a PhD where I ultimately did a thesis on origin of life biology, because I had simultaneously developed interest in other origins questions, in particular the origin of the universe, this whole discussion about fine-tuning. Some of that also debated originated at that conference. I did a lot of work while I was in both my master's and PhD on history and philosophy of physics, and that intersects obviously with cosmological questions. So I've kind of been fascinated with these "where did we get here" questions for a very long time. And I started, my first major book was Signature in the Cell, DNA and the Evidence for Intelligent Design, which was a kind of a culmination of things I've been thinking about during my PhD on origin of life biology. But the most recent book brought in the cosmological and the physical arguments about fine-tuning and the origin of the universe as well. So it's kind of been a long arc for me and a fascination for a long time.
And it's been interesting to see the different iterations of what you've done. I mean, many people will know you for being, a major proponent of intelligent design, which has been a sort of controversial kind of topic in scientific circles. I've sensed that there seems to be more openness, interestingly, to some of the aspects of design. The more I speak to certain scientists in the mainstream sciences.
I think we're finding that quite a lot, actually, especially among younger scientists coming up, that there's the kind of simplistic 19th century way of looking at life as a bottom-up phenomenon that's been produced by this undirected, unguided mechanism of mutation selection has, I think, failed as an explanatory program. So you're finding this proliferation of new theories of evolution to compensate for the perceived lack of creative power associated with the main Darwinian mechanism. But that phenomenon within evolutionary biology is also opening people's minds to the possibility that we may be looking at a top-down phenomenon and that there may be a different way to look at life, which is what intelligent design does.
Well, we're not going to be covering that ground today because that's probably material for another another episode. Perhaps we could bring you into conversation at some point with someone on that. But it has led to invitations to big platforms like Joe Rogan. You were on there a couple of years ago talking about these issues. It feels like there's even in the general public, a kind of an openness to bigger explanations, let's say.
We're not quite as disreputable as we once were. I will say that.
Okay. Phil, speaking of disreputable, no, I'm joking. Thank you for coming on.
Oh, you know me too well, Justin.
I know. Now, we've been friends for a number of years now. Give us a little background to you, because when we started engaging, it was because you were taking an interest, I think, in some of these philosophical, theological debates, initially around the questions of suffering, but then increasingly your interest turns towards these questions about whether cosmology points to God or not. Where did it begin for you?
So I was brought up Jewish, and I went to Hebrew school and did all the usual things, learned the Torah and Hebrew language and blah, blah, blah. And I was a believer, strong believer, until my teenage years. This is usually when the rebellion kicks in, isn't it? The things that sort of made me turn against my faith, if I remember rightly, well, one of them was just learning what the Jewish New Year meant. Like this year is 5,786. Do you guys know what that's, let's say, roughly 6,000 years? 6,000 years from what? Do you know?
Tell us.
It's from the creation of the world.
Right. I assumed it probably might be.
Yeah, you thought it might be right. I thought, that doesn't sound right. So that sort of gave me a bit of skepticism. And then I think the big event that I recall was the Passover ceremony. We do this ceremony every year, and I have to sing this song in Hebrew, which basically says, tell me about the Exodus story. And eventually I took the view that, oh my God, this is horrific. God targets, the innocents. I think 6 or 7 of the plagues target the animals. And that really, really affected me. I thought, wow, the first plague, the fish die because the Nile is turned to blood. In the last plague, all the firstborn are killed, including the domestic animals. So think of all the puppies and kittens. And I just thought, this is horrific. So that turned me against my faith. And then when Dawkins came out with the God delusion, he had that quote, what was it? The Old Testament God is the most unpleasant character in all of fiction.
Yes.
I just thought, oh, yeah,
right.
That's what I've always thought.
There you go.
So it really resonated with me. So that maybe put me a bit more engagement. It wasn't part of my life at all, I think, until maybe the God delusion came out. And now what also happened was I went back to university as an adult to study astronomy. I've always been fascinated with astronomy and got a telescope and I do astroimaging
And this was after your career in banking, was it?
yeah. So I was in derivatives trading, and you might think that's a completely different field, and in some sense, of course, it is. But actually, a lot of the same maths is used in pricing derivatives as is used in physics. And in fact, a lot of people on the trading floor have PhDs in physics and maths. And sometimes on the trading floor, it's like really busy. But sometimes it's really quiet and you just have really interesting chats with people who are like super educated. So I thought these chats I had a lot of guys who had theoretical physics background. We had lots of chats and it did engage me to sort of get back into an interest in science, which I did have as a child. And so UCL was my home for a couple of years. I went back there to study at University College London and went back to study astronomy. And I got very interested. We did lots of courses in various things like astrobiology and optics and all kinds of interesting topics. But the thing that I was most interested in was early universe cosmology. So I did my project on that. And in fact, I'll tell you a fun story on that. Someone was helping me with my project and we met at the cafe and he says, I've just got a new paper we're about to publish. We're just submitting it tonight. I said, let's have a look. And it was experimental test for the multiverse. Like, could you detect the presence of a multiverse by looking at the cosmic microwave background? This just blew me away. I thought, my God, I had no idea this was even possible, that people were even thinking about this. So I was really engaged, and I thought it would be a good idea just watch YouTube films about different competing models for the Big Bang, because I was aware there were several competing models for the Big Bang. And but there was nothing in existence. So someone once said to me, well, if you want to watch a film like that, why don't you just make it? So I thought, okay. So I did. And I started talking to cosmologists, and these were like long documentaries. So I spent a lot of time going back and forth with these guys, and I ended up making films with Stephen Hawking, Roger Penrose, Alan Guth. I mean, many, many, many big names in the field. And one name in particular kept coming up. They say this guy is real genius level, really creative thinker. And I kept seeing his name on the front cover of Scientific American. He won the prize for the best cosmology paper of the year. And this is this guy, Naish Afshordi. So I interviewed him for my series, and then we hit it off straight away. He was at the Perimeter Institute for Theoretical Physics. So I went there, and he said, maybe we should turn this into a book. So this is the book, The Battle of the Big Bang.
Battle of the Big Bang.
And I guess, yeah, one of the themes that we try and emphasize in the book is to embrace uncertainty. So I think this puts us at odds somewhat with some of the Christian apologists that want to tell a story that we know that the Big Bang was the beginning, or various other features of the universe have certain properties. What we try and do in the book is to say there's actually much more uncertainty on this stuff. And so that's where it kind of engages, and where I've engaged with the sort of apologist, counter-apologist scene.
Right.
Because what I try and emphasize is, we don't know. A lot of the assumptions are true that are used in these arguments.
Yeah. Well, I'll get you to give a brief summary of your book as well in a moment, Steve. But that's a really helpful introduction to both of you and where you come from when it comes to these issues, debating cosmology. We're also going to get to some, well, we're being sort of quite ambitious in the course of today's conversation. We're going to try and talk about science and faith in general, whether there's a conflict or not there. We're going to talk about Big Bang cosmology, and we're going to talk about the fine-tuning of the universe for life, and we will define what all those things are, and your different perspectives on whether that gives evidence or not towards evidence for God. In fact, our question specifically today is, does the science of the universe point to God? Now, it's worth saying there's at least one major area of Steve's book that we won't be covering, and that's the origin of life, which is more in the field of biology and so on, not your wheelhouse, Phil. So as I said, that could be a conversation for another time, but really looking forward to trying to grapple with these big issues that we have sketched out for ourselves in the next hour or two. Okay. But what we always do.
Sounds fun.
It does, doesn't it?
Oh, I'm sure it will be. I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah, I always say to it, I have to pinch myself sometimes that I get to do this. We sit down for a couple of hours with two brilliant minds to sketch out the differences. Anyway, here we go. What we do on this show, it's become our kind of signature move at the beginning of each show is to try and get each guest to understand each other as well as possible, even though you're going to disagree on these issues, by summarising your opponent's viewpoint as well as you can, to the point where that person can say, you've got it. Okay. Once we've done that for each other, then we'll move into the conversation, the discussion itself. So I wonder whether we could start with you, Phil, trying to summarise as best you can Steve's position on why he believes the science of the universe points towards God. And we'll see how Steve thinks you did.
Okay, well, on the spot, let's...
It's like a test, right?
Yeah, okay.
You get wrong. You'll get
I
marked.
feel like I'm being examined, but I've done my homework. So I think we're going to be okay. But who knows? You'll tell me. Okay, so Stephen's got a lot of arguments in this book. It's a big book, so I won't be able to cover all of them. But I think the ones that are going to be relevant today are, well, there's a few. So the first one is called the Kalam cosmological argument. And the Kalam can be expressed in different ways, but the standard way of expressing it, I think Stephen does do it this way in the book, is to say, okay, everything that begins to exist as a cause, the universe began to exist, therefore the universe as a cause. Now that's stage one of the Kalam cosmological argument. A lot of people think that's it for the Kalam cosmological argument, but it isn't. There's a stage two that says, okay, we actually think that this points to a God. It's not just a cause. And Stephen even makes the case that, it's actually, the monotheistic God. He makes a case against polytheism and deism and things like that. So that's one argument. Another argument is that the Bible sort of gives us reason to believe there was a beginning of the universe. So if the Bible is true, then we should expect there's a beginning to the universe. And of course, the evidence for the beginning of the universe that Stephen goes into is that the Big Bang has shown that there's a universe. The universe has a beginning. Now, there are other arguments that the universe has a beginning coming from philosophy, but the ones that Stephen focuses on in the book is from cosmology. So that's the sort of Big Bang side of things. The fine-tuning argument, of course, there's many different ways that you can express the fine-tuning argument. Some make it a deductive argument, some make it a probabilistic argument, but they're all going to trade off the notion that the constants of nature are very, very unlikely to have life-permitting values given naturalism or atheism or however you want to put it. So the best explanation, and this is Stephen's kind of main explanatory framework, is to use what's called deductive reasoning. So you look for the best explanation. So it's slightly different to deductive or inductive reasoning. So you're basically saying, here's the evidence. What's the best explanation? So Stephen thinks that the best explanation for this fine-tuning is that there's a God. I think in earlier books, Stephen was only saying that there was an intelligent designer and not really saying it's necessarily God. But I think in this book, he comes out and says, no, I'm now advocating for God, and it's the God of Judeo-Christian theism.
Okay. Well, so we had a few different things there.
Yeah.
The Kalam cosmological argument,
Yeah.
Big Bang cosmology, the fine-tuning,
Yeah.
all ultimately pointing back through abductive reasoning, as you
Yes.
said, to the best explanation being
Theism. Yeah.
theism, God. How did
Pretty
how did
well
Phil do
on
that?
the fine-tuning, but the cosmological part, there's a important subtlety. It's I'm not I did a podcast not too long ago with William Lane Craig talking about our different approaches to developing the cosmological argument. I think his deductive Kalam argument has force because I think that as best we can tell, the universe had a beginning, and the alternative models that attempt to portray some sort of pre-Big Bang state that is materialistic, I think are mainly incoherent and not satisfactory. But I think that part of the inference to the best explanation approach is that and it's something that's come out of philosophy of science, is that theory evaluation is inherently comparative. And the problem with the deductive form of an argument is that you really have no way of evaluating how deductive arguments can have probabilistic force, but it's hard to assign numbers as to exactly how sure are we of these premises unless you have some comparison class of alternative hypotheses that affirm alternative propositions. And so I think one of the things that's coming out of the philosophy of science is the recognition that scientific evaluation, as well as evaluation of metaphysical hypotheses, are inherently comparative. And so what I do in the book is I don't hang the argument, the cosmological argument, just on the fact of a beginning. I think there's strong evidence for that. And I think the alternative to denying that leads in a whole bunch of directions that I think are actually problematic for naturalists. Okay, but so I developed the argument based on the evidence we have for a beginning, but then show that if in different cosmological models, if the beginning is denied, that the cost of that to the credibility of naturalism as a worldview, what philosophers would call the epistemic cost, is very, very high. In particular, the alternative cosmological models, whether it be quantum cosmology or the cyclic conformal cosmology of Roger Penrose, or some of the other models that Phil and I think I'm going to take Naish. It's by the way, it's a beautiful book because they do just an excellent job of exposition of these different models, and for me, it's actually helped clarify and sharpen my thesis, because what I see in all these different models is a common problem, and that is that it's possible to deny a beginning by modeling an alternative cosmological model, maybe a pre-Big Bang state or a quantum cosmological model. In fact, the history of this goes all the way back to Einstein, who denied the evidence for the beginning that he saw prima facie in his own theory.
I think we'll come back to this because this is, I think, the substance of the conversation.
Let me wrap it up then for now. But the point is that invariably the non-theistic models of alternative cosmological models end up affirming something else that has theistic implications, most commonly either unexplained fine-tuning or in the case of quantum cosmology, something very similar to unexplained fine-tuning, which is the modeling of unexplained infusions of information into the mathematical apparatus that's used to model the universe. So I think the thing that Phil's summary might miss is that my argument is what is not hung entirely on the evidence for a beginning, but rather it's an argument that has what philosophers call robustness, in that if you go this direction and affirm the beginning, you've got a theistic implication. But if you deny it, the cost to a naturalist in denying it undermines naturalism and provides additional support for theism.
So there's yes. So is that helpful?
Yeah, that's,
Phil, to say it's not.
Yeah, that's
just
fine. I mean, I was trying to do a brief summary, but yeah, there's a lot more depth.
It's a critique of a naturalistic approach as much as it's a confirmation.
So as much as I like Bill and the work he's done on the Kalam argument, I think it has force. I think it's very helpful. But I've added an additional wrinkle to this that I think is not commonly appreciated. And it comes largely from studying works like this, which lay out what the contours of these different models. And I think the book's been extremely helpful to me in looking at some of the newer ones that are on the scene. I was unaware of, in fact, the VSL bithermal model of your colleague. And I'm one of the things I wonder, I'm just curious about is Phil's own predilections in this. Is that a model that you find appealing? Is that your go-to?
Like a parent saying, I'm not going to choose between my children. I think,
because you've done a lot of shows on a lot. This is your, before the Big Bang show.
Yeah. No, okay. I honestly don't have a favorite model. My feeling is that the chances of any one model in our book being true are slim, because we have, I think it's 25 different models. So what's the chance of any one? But that doesn't mean the chances of one of them being right is low. To think of a lottery, the chance of any lottery ticket winning is very, very low. But the chances of someone winning can be quite high. So I think that
that's
VSL
helpful to me, because that's how I was going to describe your position.
Well,
so,
yeah.
Let him finish.
I was going to say, we'll come back to that, because I think we want to talk about the different models, and I'll be interested to hear whether you do land more firmly on any of them, or you hold them all kind of together as a set of possibilities. But we'll come back to that, because this is going to be an important part of the discussion on Big Bang cosmology. But let's continue the exercise. And thanks, Phil, for doing a really good job of summarising.
Are we off to an okay start?
So Steve, your turn to what do you anticipate? Can you summarise what you think Phil's perspective is on this question.
Yeah, some of it's come out already, and it's been very helpful that the multiplicity of models that exclude a beginning or circumvent the evidence from observational astronomy or for some of the proofs in theoretical physics for a beginning, the multiplicity of models that deny a beginning, formulated by very leading cosmologists, suggests that we need to be at least uncertain about whether there was a beginning and maybe even doubt it. And the thing that we most certainly need to do is to refrain from using the evidence for a beginning as the basis of a theistic argument.
Okay, how's that as a summary?
Yeah, it's pretty much spot on. Maybe the only thing I would say is, I would say, even if we had no models that said the universe didn't have a beginning or the Big Bang wasn't the beginning, it wouldn't actually matter because the proofs of the beginning are not trustworthy. So it wouldn't matter at all if, let's suppose, every model that we had in that book was proven to be wrong. Wouldn't make any difference.
Okay.
Because the proofs are not very convincing, quite frankly.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Well, that's helpful. Well, I'm glad we've found the uncommon ground here. You know, you both be able to, broadly speaking, describe each other's position on this. So we're going to
This is what I used to force my students to do in philosophy of science classes. Yeah, that's the source of the Bob Dylan quote.
Absolutely. I've heard that Daniel Dennett did the same thing, you know, in his, you know, classes as well, made sure his students
So we expect some academic credit when we're done with the conversation.
Absolutely. Yeah. Pats on the back all round. So let's start, discussing the differences at this point. Let's start actually just with the broad theme of science and faith. I mean, Phil, do you feel like there is a fundamental conflict between believing in God and doing good science?
I think, no, doing good science, definitely not.
Okay.
Like, no question, no. You can be a religious believer and you can do good science. There's no question about that.
Where does the conflict lie, if there is one?
So, and let me give you another common ground between Steve and I. There's this thesis that historians of science use called the Draper-White thesis, and it says that the relationship between science and religion is one of perpetual conflict. And I think that's false. I think that's obviously false. So I don't sign up to the Draper-White theory, and I don't think there's any conflict between being a religious scientist. That's fine. But I do think there are what I would call is a probabilistic conflict. So let me try and unpack what that means. And it goes back to something that basically, if you go back to, let's say, Tycho Brahe, who was, for those that don't know who he was a very famous astronomer. And he was like the greatest astronomer of his age just before the telescope. And he examined the Copernican model. Oh, I say Copernican model. Actually, Copernicus didn't come up with a heliocentric model. It was Aristarchus of Samos about 2,000 years earlier. But anyway, he didn't necessarily know about that. But so the Copernican model came out, and Tycho Brahe says, he gave arguments against it from physics, but he also said, but it contradicts Holy Scripture, which must be paramount. And I think science today says not only is Holy Scripture not paramount, but it's not to be considered at all. And so whereas, of course, in the religious tradition, or in the Christian religion tradition, which is, the one of relevance here because, Stephen's a Christian, 2 Timothy says all Scripture is God-breathed. And, then you have this tension, right? What happens when Holy Scripture seems to contradict the consensus in science? And of course, there are many, many things that Scripture, at least on the face of it, says that do conflict with science. So the world is not 6,000 years old. There wasn't sort of primordial water. There's not a solid dome of the sky. It wasn't created in 6 days. And on we can go with many, many examples. So now, with that in mind, there are sort of 3 positions I think you could broadly take, right? 1 is to embrace the science and reject the religion. 2 is to embrace the religion and reject the science. Or 3, find some way to reconcile them. But notice that 2 out of those 3 strategies is going to lead you into a conflict. And we have some data. That's all hypothetical, of course. We actually have data on what people really think. So there was a survey in Time magazine of Americans, and they were asked, what would you do if a scientific fact contradicted an element of your faith? And 64% of them said they would reject the science. There's surveys of how many people think the world is less than 10,000 years old. And the answers do often depend on how you phrase the question, but it's somewhere between sort of 20 and 40%. Surveys of people on climate change, we find something like 90% of atheists accept the science, about 45% of Christians do, about 32% of evangelicals do. So what you find is that, that's why I'm saying it's a probabilistic conflict. It's not that religion, or Christian religion in particular, forces you to oppose science, but what it does do is increase the probability that you will.
That's a helpful way
Right.
of putting it. Yeah, in real life situations, if you are a Christian, you're more likely on average to be skeptical of certain scientific
it's just
consensus
like
and
smoking, right? If you smoke, you're more likely to get cancer. Does it guarantee you get cancer? No, it doesn't. Could you get cancer without smoking? Yes, you can. Right? So similarly, you can oppose science and be an atheist.
Well, it'd be interesting your perspective on this, whether you broadly agree or not with Phil's take on the probabilistic way in which
it's a very
science is
nuanced
played
way of explaining the view he has. I found that illuminating. I've written a lot on this, and not just the origins questions, but just on the models that people have developed for capturing the relationship between science and religious belief, biblical faith, if you will, and specifically. One of the things, we're starting a new center in Cambridge called the Whewell Center for Science and Natural Theology. And one of the things that's very clear in the history of science is the very important role that Judeo-Christian, that is biblical assumptions, played in the foundation of modern science, particularly in the period that historians call the scientific revolution, and that natural theology itself played a very important role in that. I'm quite a fan of the work of John Ray, who is often regarded as the father of modern botany. It turns out that Ray was very close with Isaac Barrow, who was Newton's tutor, and there's this tradition of natural theological thought in Cambridge that was crucial to the rise of the scientific revolution. One of my Cambridge supervisors, historian of physics, told me when I was doing work on the debate about universal gravitation in the 17th century, he said, if you miss Newton's theism, you've missed everything. The Principia was a theological project. So I like that Phil has rejected the Draper and White thesis that science and religion have been always at odds and are intrinsically so. Then that's the sort of conflict model. The alternative, I like to think of this in terms of propositions, that you have, there are propositions that come out of the scientific endeavor, there are propositions that come out of a biblical text or out of a theological tradition, and those propositions can either disagree, in which case you have conflict, they can often be talking, or they can agree, in which case you have some kind of harmony or concord or agreement, or they may be propositions that are addressing different topics altogether and can neither agree or disagree. And so there are four basic models that people talk about when they talk about the relationship between science and faith. They'll talk about the conflict model, the compartmentalism model, a variant of that called the complementarity model, where it's not that science and religion are talking about two completely different things, but they're talking about the same thing in different incommensurable language, which also leads to the proposition that science is inherently neutral with respect to metaphysical or religious claims. And then there's a model that I've kind of developed, which I call qualified agreement, and that it acknowledges that, yes, there have been times of conflict. It also acknowledges that oftentimes science and religion are talking about two different things. There's the famous Galileo aphorism that says that the Bible tells you how to go to heaven, not how the heavens go. But I also point out that there are many questions that science addresses that are not religiously neutral. Questions about, for example, the origin of the universe and the origin of life, and historical questions about, for example, whether there were people like Pontius Pilate and Herod Antipas and Josephus, Caiaphas and others around the time of the trial of Jesus in the New Testament. So the Bible makes factual claims about time, space, and reality, and when it does, there are sometimes points of tension, but what I have seen is a progressive increase. This is a kind of probabilistic argument, but over time there's a progressive increasing agreement between the two. And so that's why I call it qualified agreement, that on balance you have an agreement, there are some points of tension where either we're getting the science wrong, or we're getting the biblical interpretation wrong, or we just don't know enough yet. So that's kind of the way I look at it. And I find science to be, I've done physics, I've done geology, I've done biology. I love science, and I find that it can, the broad, both the approach of the scientific inquiry, the methodology of science, and the deliverances of science fit nicely with the biblical faith that I have.
Really helpful. Thank you, Steve. I mean, just starting to draw this together, Phil, from your perspective, Steve, one of the points he makes is that the very fact that the scientific pioneers were broadly speaking Christian and did things out of their Christian convictions. I don't know whether you agree with that broadly, but obviously Steve says there is this model that he believes is quite fruitful, which is this qualified agreement. Obviously quite different to Stephen Jay Gould's non-overlapping magisterium.
It's precisely the opposite.
It's the opposite of that.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. What's your feel? Is that a fruitful approach? Do you agree that science does stand on the shoulders of a number of Christian pioneers?
Well, I think, but they stand on non-Christian pioneers, right? So that's the point. Yes, of course, Newton was a Christian. I mean, unless you think his doubting of the Trinity makes him not a Christian, but I always say yes, he was a Christian, right? So, but of course, there were lots of people that we owe science to that were not Christians. The Greeks, of course, made huge contributions to science. So, for example, the pre-Socratics, we have Anaximander. Anaximander came up with this idea that the Earth is floating in space. No one had this idea before him, as far as I know. Everyone thought the Earth sits on water. And Karl Popper, who was, a very, very famous philosopher scientist, I'm sure most people will have heard of, he said this is one of the most portentous, most incredible ideas ever put forward, because it established this idea that actually we explain the world through physical principles. I mean, he said everything moves by necessity, which some people would interpret as laws. Then, of course, you have the Pythagoreans who said science is described by mathematics. We need mathematics to describe the world. An incredible step. Then we had, people like Eratosthenes who measured the circumference of the world. They didn't experiment. They used mathematics and they came to conclusions about the world. And they got the answer right within about 10%, back in ancient Greece. This is all before Christianity. Then we have the Indians. The Indians came up with the idea of atoms. They gave us the mathematical tools that we need to do modern science. Then we have the Arabs. The Arabs had huge contributions. So I think...
And then Chinese sort of instrumentation and so
on. The compass.
Well, I mean, look, do you mind if I pass that back to Steve?
Sure.
That's a helpful riposte. Pre-Christian civilization and thinkers were starting to develop these ideas, even if they were then taken further by Christian civilization.
Yeah, sure. I have very little bad to say about the Greeks, but I, in grad school, read a really interesting article, history of science article, about the juridical, about the origin of the concept of natural law, and the author argued that it was a juridical concept of theological origins, and he specifically traced this back and showed that in Greco-Roman writings you have the concept of law, of the natural law, but it was the idea of the ability to access the moral law through reason, but that the idea of laws applying to nature was something that came out of the Hebrew Bible, and he cited particular passages that were of keen importance to a number of the founders of the period of science during the period of the scientific revolution. And so there were distinctively Judeo-Christian contributions to the rise of modern science, and one that a number of historians of science have focused on, not just the idea of lawfulness, but two others. One, the idea of intelligibility, the idea that nature has secrets to reveal, and we can understand those secrets because being made in the image of the rational creator who made nature to manifest a rational design, our minds are attuned to the way nature was made. So there was a principle of correspondence between, as John Polkinghorne, the Cambridge physicist, used to put it, the reason within matches the reason without, the external, the reason built into nature. And that gave kind of unprecedented confidence to people in the ability to explore
And as far as
things.
you're aware, that didn't exist in
not
the Greek
not
world.
at all to the same degree. And then there was a uniquely Christian contribution, which was the idea, and this was coming into vogue in the late medieval period with Catholic philosophers, and also during the period of the Reformation. And that was this recovery of the doctrine of creation, as opposed to sort of the Greek notion of an internal logos. And with that came the idea of what's called contingency, that nature, there is an order in nature. The Greeks believed in an order in nature, and that it could be understood. But they believed that the order derived from this common source of all things, this logos, and so that it could be understood essentially deductively. Whereas in the period of the scientific revolution, with the idea of a creation that was dependent on the will of an external creator who had a mind, who could have chosen to do things otherwise, we couldn't deduce what nature must be like. We had to go out and look and see. Robert Boyle said it is not the job of the natural philosopher to say what God must have done, but rather to go and look and see what he did do. And there was actually a papal decree that condemned what was called necessarian theology. And there were all of these propositions that, planets must move in perfect circles. Why? Because that's the most logical way for them to do. So there was a sense in which the Greek heritage had bound science to a set of what seemed to be most logical propositions, whereas there was a liberating element as the doctrine of creation began to be more well appreciated again, and this idea of contingency
to a kind of more empirical, observational, testable sort of way.
Which again is not to impugn the Greeks, because I think they were just the most enlightened of the ancient peoples, but there was something that they were missing that the Judeo-Christian view, I think, helped. But the Judeo-Christian view brought, that helped to liberate an empirical science. And many historians of science have...
Yeah. Anything to say in response?
Well, I think that idea of contingency was there already in the ancient Greeks, because there was a notion in Lucretius, and he talks about something called the swerve. So he builds on what Anaximander said, which is that all things move according to necessity along with the order of time, which I think is an implication of something like a physical law. But what the atomists said, the ancient Greek atomists said, that there was this thing called the swerve. So basically you have roughly a deterministic universe, but the atoms do this swerve, which gives you some degree of indeterminism. So there's your contingency. So it was there in ancient Greece already. So I think
the sense I get from Steve here is more that it was really in the Christian period that this idea of that you can go out and test the universe, look at it, and rather than. But
I think it was there. It was there. It was there before.
I think certainly you have the notion of chance and necessity in the Greeks, but you get, starting with this university with people like Grosseteste, you get these systematic methods of interrogating nature. I know one of your points, Phil, is that you think you said that many Christians are not skeptical enough, that
that's the problem. I just want to say one thing on
this
that.
Method of isolation of variables, of what is the precursors to the method of inference to the best explanation. This was coming out of the Catholic universities in the late medieval period, University of Paris, University of Oxford, and then it blossoms into very sophisticated methods of investigating and interrogating nature in this period when people are convinced, first of all, that nature is intelligible, and secondly, that it's radically contingent on the will of the creator and therefore must be investigated empirically. We can't rely simply on, and so I think there's a famous Cambridge historian of science, Herbert Butterfield, who asks this. He says it's the why there, why then question. Something unique happens in Western Europe between 1500 and 1700 with roots back to 1300, so forth, that didn't happen anywhere else.
Its roots back and back and back. Look, science has contributions from all not all cultures, but many cultures, okay? So the Greeks, look, the torch has been passed from culture to culture. So at one point, the Greeks were probably the leading developers of science, and they made huge contributions to development of science, right? No one wants to say that the Christian culture didn't contribute. Of course it did, right? But I reject this notion of a scientific revolution. And what's funny is that one of your colleagues, Glenn Scrivener, made this point. There wasn't a scientific revolution. There have been many scientific revolutions. Or we could say there's a scientific evolution. Maybe that's a better way to put it.
Well, maybe.
Yeah, maybe, Steve.
But it sounds like, though, you're not convinced that Christianity was almost required to bring us to where we are today in terms of.
Think about this. Everyone could see there are irregularities in nature. You don't need to have a theological belief to say, look, there are irregularities in nature, maybe we can understand them. That goes back thousands and thousands of years. You look at the moon and you see it has phases. You look at the stars, you see that there are patterns. You can see there are seasons by looking at the stars. Everyone can see there's structure in nature, there's patterns. So people want to investigate them. They're curious. And I think the fact that human beings are curious is actually what's driving this.
Well, but during the period of the scientific revolution, what happened was that the notion of regularity having a theological underpinning was then conjoined with the idea of the divine rationality. And the result of that was the mathematizing of those regularities. And that's a huge surge forward. And this is one of the things that was emphasized to me when I was working on Newton and on the Principia, or Principia, depending on how you like your Latin, right? That the Principia was a theological project, that Newton was trying to explicate the divine rationality in precise mathematical form as a way of giving glory to God and also giving and illuminating nature. And so I think something there and we're probably not going to come to agreement on this, but I've got 3 chapters on this in the book, and I think I don't deny that there were preceding contributions from other culture, but something really unique and revolutionary happened in Western Europe during that period of time, and it resulted in both the conjoining of mathematics to the regularities, in the development of very systematic methods of interrogating nature, these methods of isolating variables, and a revolutionary advance in understanding. There was.
We could keep going.
Can I just say one last thing?
One last thing, and then we'll.
All right, happy to give you the last word.
Okay, no, you can have the last word. 5. There's just something I've got to get off my chest. The mathematics was used because the mathematics had been developed over thousands of years. So it's really hard to do calculations without using the number system that we have. That came from the Indians. Let's give them some credit, right? The algebra came from the Arabs. Let's give them some credit, right? So more importantly, I think we shouldn't underestimate the importance of contingency. The fact that I agree, maybe we shouldn't use the word scientific revolution, but there certainly was a very significant development that happened in the 17th century, okay? I think a lot of that is just chance and accident. One of the most important things that happened in the 17th century was the invention of the telescope, because what that did was it enabled scientists to compare ancient dogmas with actual empirical observations in a way that could never have been done before. The telescope, by all accounts, was invented by an accident. People just noticed, if we put these lenses together, we start magnifying things, and not just a telescope, the microscope too, because then we started to understand, oh my God, there's this whole hidden world of bacterial diseases.
Sure.
So there's so much contingency involved here.
And we'll leave it there.
Yeah,
I suspect Stephen would just
I have
the
things to say about that too, but that's fine.
empirical method is sort of
I think we can agree
that,
that there, especially in that period of history, there was not a conflict between science and religion, and that therefore there is no intrinsic or long-standing perpetual conflict between science and religion, as the Draper and White folks have said. Right?
That at least is a point of commonality. Okay. Hi there, if you're enjoying today's video, do give it a like and subscribe to my channel. And why not let me know what you think in the comments below? And to make sure you don't miss any of these fantastic conversations, sign up for my newsletter. As a thank you, I'll send you the first chapters of both my books, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God and Why I'm Still a Christian, for free. The newsletter link is with the info. Enjoy the rest of the show. Brilliant. Let's talk about our next big subject. Literally Big Bang cosmology. And it might be helpful just to, again, reiterate, Steve, that in your book, Return of the God Hypothesis.
Let's hold both books up, shall we?
Why don't we? Return of the God Hypothesis. There are these 3 specific major scientific discoveries that you're talking about from the past century, which for you point back towards the idea of a divine creator. The first of which you tackle is Big Bang cosmology, this idea that the universe had a beginning. So this is going to be our first major point of discussion. Perhaps you'd like to start by sketching out your case here for the way in which cosmology has pointed towards an origins event for the universe, and why you believe this lends evidence to the idea of a God.
Yeah, sure. Phase one of the argument, okay. If the argument is predicated on the evidence that we have of a beginning, that there are several very key discoveries from observational astronomy that have pointed back to a beginning point. You have the redshift data from astronomy showing that the universe appears to be expanding outward. If you back extrapolate that expansion, you get to a point of convergence where you can't back extrapolate any further, suggesting a starting point for the expansion and arguably the universe itself. There are other evidences from observational astronomy that have reinforced that. Things like the cosmic background radiation that was first discovered in the 1960s with Penzias and Wilson. The subsequent discoveries of COBE satellite showing that the kind of perturbations you would expect on a Big Bang model were also present in those in the background radiation, and then further, there's a whole host of other empirical observations about the ages of galaxies and so forth that fit with the idea of a beginning point. In the book, I also point out that there are developments in theoretical physics, the singularity theorems of Hawking and Penrose, and the BGV theorem of Borde-Guth-Vilenkin, that in one case I think provides a proof, in another case a strong indicator of a beginning. The thing about something in theoretical physics or attempts to make proofs is they're always predicated on certain assumptions or conditions. In the podcast, Phil, you did with Sir Roger Penrose, I was honored to be mentioned, even if it was in the mode of a critique. Just to make sure we're understanding each other, he critiqued me for not describing the conditions under which the singularity theorems would apply. I have an extensive discussion of that, the weak and strong energy conditions, the whole issue of quantum gravity inside the Planck unit. So I'm well aware of those limitations on the proof. So my conclusion about the singularity theorem was not that it provided an absolute proof, but a strong pointer to a beginning. And it's actually kind of worth, I think, remembering what Hawking was thinking about when he first proposed this. That Hawking was doing was doing black hole physics at Cambridge. He's a PhD student, and he's aware that in general relativity, massive bodies cause the curvature of space. So he's thinking about the evidence for the expanding universe, and he realizes that as you go in the forward direction of time, matter is going to get more and more and more diffuse. But then if he winds that backwards, that as the matter gets more and more densely concentrated in the reverse direction of time, then you'll get a tighter and tighter and tighter curvature, going back to some limiting case, some point in the past where you can't get any more tightly curved. Now, and we'll discuss this because, as I said, I'm well aware of the limitation on that proof is that when you get small enough, quantum effects become very important, and the depiction of matter is no longer as I'm going to say his name again, Naesh explains this very well, that you have, we no longer conceive of matter as spatially discrete, but it's a wavicle, it's spatially extended, and it's a particle at the same time. And so we don't really know if you're going to get continued curvature, but when you get to that point, you're inside the Planck unit, which is 10 to the minus 43rd of a second, or as Hawking and Ellis pointed out in their 1972 book, you're inside 10 to the minus 33rd of a centimeter of space. And in that first book, they said, well, that's not an absolute singularity, but it's, for all intents and purposes, a singularity. So I'm in my development of the case, I want to say that's a very strong indicator as to what was going on in the past, that we're going back to a beginning point of some kind. And then I think the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem provides additional support for that based on special relativity. It's not subject to the same condition or other conditions that are important, and some of these pre-Big Bang models provide model-specific exceptions or exemptions to the BGV theorem. But I think on balance, it too is providing epistemic support for a beginning. That's part one of my argument. The part two, I don't know if you want to interrupt.
Let's just try and bring this into a summary.
Well, here's the big point about that.
Go ahead.
If you have a beginning,
You have a beginning.
okay, and if we're going to any argument predicated on a beginning is going to create difficulties for a materialistic worldview, because either before the beginning, which we have to put in scare quotes because time is beginning, or independent of the beginning in an ontological sense, there is nothing materialistic to do the causing, because what is beginning is matter, energy, space, and time. So on a straightforward conclusion based on observational astronomy, and I think the most straightforward reading of these proofs from theoretical physics, I think you have a not a proof, but strong evidence of a beginning, and that poses a problem for materialism, an explanatory challenge for materialism that it can't meet, that theism can meet, because if you posit an independent entity who transcends matter, space, and time, and also has powers of volition, you have the necessary conditions of an adequate explanation, causal explanation for the origin of the universe if it had a beginning.
Okay. So just before I bring Phil in to start to push back on this, just in summary, your view is that looking at what you might call, as far as you can see it, consensus view on cosmology.
Not so much consensus, but more of a prima facie case based on observational evidence,
on what we know
and theoretical physics.
Observational evidence of the universe that appears to show, if you wound the clock back, you would get to this very hot, dense state in the past and what appears to be a beginning moment. You likewise add in the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin Theorem, singularity theorems that Penrose and others formulated. And there's a lot of different strands that point back to the idea that there is a beginning.
It's as I concluded at the end of the chapter on this, the sixth chapter of my book, as best we can tell, there was a beginning.
As best we can tell.
Acknowledging that there are loopholes that could be
and we'll explore some of those.
Yeah.
But the reason that this gives us evidence for a creator outside of the universe is because you have to posit something like that when what you're talking about coming into existence essentially is matter, time, space, and energy. You have to have something that in a sense transcends those categories, and this appears to be the God therefore is.
Right, and I think one of the interesting things about the alternative cosmological models is that they always have to posit something that is separate from or transcendent from the observable universe we have. It may be a prior mathematical state, as in quantum cosmology, or it might be a prior Big Bang. But transcendence, in the strict sense of the word, as something separate from, seems, I think, by all concerned, to be something conceded as a necessary condition of explanation. Causes need to be separate from the effects that they produce.
Okay, Phil.
Okay, so let's just take a step back. And talk about the broader conversation here about the Big Bang and the beginning. What's often happening is that there's a bit of a bait and switch going on. In particular, two notions of the Big Bang are getting confused. So in our book, we talk about one definition of the Big Bang, which we call the hot Big Bang. And that says that's a theory, if you like, that says the universe evolved from an incredibly hot, dense state. And that theory says nothing at all about what came before that. It doesn't say whether there was a beginning of time or not. It just says the universe evolved from a hot, dense state. The other definition that we talk about for the Big Bang is the Big Bang singularity. So the universe evolved from a singular state. What we mean here is that the curvature, the pressure, the density goes to infinity. This is the sort of beginning of time, if you like. Now, all the observational evidence only tells us that there was a hot, dense state. It doesn't say there was a singularity. In fact, I would say there is no evidence at all that says, not any empirical evidence that says there was a singularity. In fact, you can't really get any empirical evidence for a singularity. It doesn't make any predictions. And in fact, there's something called the cosmic censorship conjecture, which I think is very plausible, that says actually singularities are hidden behind horizons. And in fact, if you could see a singularity, you would actually have a breakdown of causality, which would threaten the Kalam in the other way. It would threaten the causal principle, perhaps. So we can't see singularities. There's no observational evidence for them. And in fact, we did a survey of physicists, and I've done 2 surveys now. And this is very important. We So the first one we did was a survey. Was at a conference organized by the Niels Bohr Institute in Copenhagen, and it had leading physicists there in theoretical physics and astronomy, cosmology, astrophysics, numerical relativity, and it had top people. And we asked them various questions and controversies within physics. We asked them, I think it was 12 questions, things like, what you think is the best candidate for dark matter, for dark energy? And the only question that we got a majority view on anything on was that the Big Bang should only be understood as the hot Big Bang, not as a Big Bang singularity. So when physicists say we've got evidence from the cosmic microwave background and the redshift and blah, 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 they're only saying the hot Big Bang. Okay. So this is not empirical evidence of a beginning of the universe. Okay. Now, and in fact, I would challenge Stephen, what empirical evidence could you possibly have of a singularity? I just can't see how.
Should we pass that back then? So
Mm-hmm.
the hot Big Bang is not evidence of a beginning, and the singularity theorem itself is contested, says...
Well, we'll come on to that. It's more like we couldn't observe a singularity if there was one.
Well, of course, that's where the laws of physics would break down. I'm not disputing that. The point is that the back extrapolation that's been involved in inferring the hot Big Bang state takes you back to a point of convergence past which you cannot go. And that's a consequence of the redshift as much as it is the consequence of the singularity of Hawking and Penrose, the singularity theorems. The point that I'm making is that it's a reasonable conclusion to believe that the universe had a beginning. There's no way of getting beyond that hot Big Bang to something before. This is something that in the book, I'm stumbling again over his name. Nietzsche he agrees with William Lane Craig that there's no evidence for a beginningless universe.
But we also said there's no evidence for a beginning.
No. There's a difference between evidence and proof, and I think what happens throughout your book is that there's an absolute 100% standard of proof required for anyone who wants to say that the universe had a beginning.
That's not what we're talking about.
And well, that's what to suspend the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin Theorem simply because there are models that could circumvent its conditions is to require an absolute proof.
No, it's not. It isn't. It just isn't. It does. We're not looking for an absolute proof. That's just not
I'm
correct.
saying that there's evidence of a beginning because the back extrapolation.
Well, can we agree there's no empirical evidence for a singularity?
Well, you wouldn't get an empirical.
Right. All right. So
singularity
we are
is an artifact of mathematical physics.
So let's find the common ground.
Yeah,
we agree.
Right, but that's a red herring because no one has ever said that.
Hang on.
Let me just get this.
The singularity has a technical definition in physics, which is a place where the laws of physics break down. There's no possibility of empirical evidence of a singularity. But
it's a hypothesis based on extrapolating the mathematics.
Conjoined with general relativity that would lead you to think that you're getting to a singularity or a near singularity. But I'd like not to get hung up on.
Yeah, can I come?
Well, just so that I can understand the empirical evidence we do have from cosmic microwave background radiation, redshift, and so on. You're saying that all that gets you is a hot dense state, not a beginning. But you're saying that you think it's consistent with and lends evidence towards the idea of a beginning. Because
and there have been,
when you join
I don't know what their
with
survey has
singularity
shown,
theorems
but
and so on.
I first encountered this with very compelling talk by Alan Sandage, Robert Jastrow. Many of the physicists who were first articulating the case for the Big Bang thought it clearly pointed to a beginning. And so...
Okay, well, let's pass it back to Phil now.
Where we're getting confused is the difference between evidence for something and an absolute 100% certain proof, which is
and this is asking for that. That's just
no. So you're keen to say we're looking for an inference to the best explanation, not necessarily this 100% deductive proof. But
science doesn't give you deductive proof.
No, it doesn't, and we're not asking for it.
So go ahead. Go ahead.
But it seems like you are, though. That's
no, absolutely not.
You believe, obviously, Steve's mischaracterizing it.
Yeah, it's just not. We're not asking for 100% proof. No. Okay. What we're asking for is an understanding of physics that we don't have at the moment. Okay. So basically, what these singularity theorems prove is that the space-time that obeys the condition of the theorem encounters a singularity. But it doesn't say there isn't some other space-time that doesn't obey the condition of the theorem. So now you have to ask, well, what are the assumptions in the theorem? Are they trustworthy? Because if they're not trustworthy, the conclusion isn't trustworthy. And what I think there's very broad consensus on in physics is that the conclusions are not trustworthy. In fact, right, the people that invented them, Penrose, Hawking, Ellis, Garock, they I think
They have abandoned them.
they've abandoned them, right? Not as, they haven't abandoned in terms of the mathematics is good mathematics, right? No one's saying that the maths is wrong, right? The question is, for any physical theory, you have physical assumptions. So the question is, are the assumptions trustworthy? Now, there are various assumptions. We go through them in the book. I'm not going to go through them all here, but I'll pick the one that I think is the most important. And that is that Einstein's theory of gravity describes the universe at all scales. And that is an assumption that almost, I think, most cosmologists would say is wrong, right? It's wrong because there's a contradiction between relativity and quantum mechanics.
Quantum mechanics, of course.
Right?
Yeah.
So they contradict each other, right? Now, for the most part, we can ignore that, right? The quantum effects are very big, things are tiny. So we just ignore it. It's fine. It doesn't matter. But the Big Bang, it does matter, right? Because here,
In this Planck unit of time.
well, when you get to when the universe is incredibly hot and dense, you're going to have to bring in quantum mechanics, right? That's the broad consensus view. There are a few exceptions, right? Penrose actually thinks you don't need quantum mechanics, but nevertheless, he challenges one of the other assumptions of his own theorem, and his assumption is that you can measure. You have to assume there's 3 space dimensions, 1 time dimension, which you can measure with rulers and clocks. And he's saying you couldn't build a ruler or clock in the early universe. So actually out with the singularity theorem. But let's put that to one side. The main one is this quantum gravity issue. We want to combine general relativity with quantum mechanics. And until we do that, we can't believe what the theory is telling us. Now, have we done that? Not successfully. I mean, there are proposals. There's string theory, there's loop quantum gravity, there's causal sets, there's asymptotic safety.
There's quantum
blah, blah,
cosmology.
blah.
Yeah.
Right, so but even if all of those are wrong, until we get that theory, we just don't know, right? So it's not that we don't have the final proof. We're not saying we need this 100% tight, deductive proof. No, science doesn't work that way. What we're saying is the theorems just can't be trusted, full stop. Because they need this quantum gravity theory,
And this
which
is where
we
I
don't
would
have.
disagree, Phil. I think they're pointing to something, and Borde-Guth-Vilenkin, which is not based on as restrictive conditions, I think points more decisively in that direction. But the other part of my argument is that if you decide you don't want to depict the beginning of the universe classically in general relativistic terms, as it were, and you invoke a pre-Planck time quantum description of the universe, you invariably get a universe that is depicted as a superposition of essentially possible states of affairs, possible gravitational fields with different configurations of space and matter within those fields. And the depiction is essentially not materialistic. It's mathematical. It's a depiction of possible states. And Vilenkin has pointed out that this is very odd because you have this whole mathematical apparatus that precedes the beginning of the universe in quantum cosmology, which is taking into account the limitations of the singularity theorems, the conditions that have to be met. It says we need a theory of quantum gravity. And you end up with a system that has a big hairy equation, the Wheeler-DeWitt equation, that needs to be solved to give us a universal wave function. And the idea is that if the universal wave function includes among the possible states of affairs in superposition a universe like ours, it will then constitute an explanation of the origin of the universe. But that mathematical apparatus that precedes the origin of the universe is mathematical, it's conceptual. So what Vilenkin has noticed is that he says, before there's matter, space, time, and energy, what tablet could these laws referring to that whole apparatus be written on? He said, if math is the domain of the mind, are we actually saying that the universe has come out of mind? And what I'm arguing is that when the straightforward Kalam argument rendered, however, whether as an inference to the best explanation or as a deductive argument, is circumvented by alternative models of cosmology, and I think every one of the ones you would discuss reveals this, that something is affirmed in those models that has its own theistic implications. In particular, unexplained fine-tuning, or in quantum cosmology, the big hairy equation that has to be solved, the Wheeler-DeWitt equation, is solved by the physicists making arbitrary choices of the boundary constraints they're going to apply to the equation in order to get a universal wave function out that includes a universe like ours. It's a teleological modeling where there's an information input by the physicist into the mathematical apparatus to get a wave function out that will provide an explanation of the origin of the universe. Well, that's intelligent design. They're modeling the input of information into a mathematical apparatus to model how the universe could have come into existence. And you find this in the Steinhardt model, not the same kind of thing, but these unexplained inputs of information or fine-tuning in all the attempts to circumvent the beginning. So yes, you can get around the beginning, but at an epistemic cost to naturalism. And that is always the affirmation of unexplained fine-tuning and often some very, very wonky physics, which is why you're correct to say that you're probably right. Most of the 25 models are not going to be correct.
Okay, so there's a lot of information there. All right, so
there's a lot there.
There's a lot
to go through them one by
there.
one.
Okay, let me.
The point I'm making is I'm not hanging the whole of my argument on the evidence for beginning, but I think we've been far too diffident about seeing what the gravamen of the body of evidence is showing, that it's pointing strongly in that direction. But if you don't like the beginning and you circumvent it with a quantum cosmology or a conformal cosmology or any of the others discussed in the book, you invariably have an epistemic cost.
Okay, so if I could attempt my layman's summary, and feel free to correct me on this, yes, there are other models, and you represent a number of them in the book that don't necessarily point to a beginning, but each of them comes at a cost, says Stephen, in terms of there being some other payoff, which in his view do have some kind of theistic interpretation. And in the end, particularly those that invoke a kind of a mathematical kind of solution to some of these issues are kind of inferring some kind of information input from the outset.
They require it. They require it as a condition of explanation.
Yeah. And so whichever way you look at it, there's going to be something pointing back to the God conclusion as far as Steve is concerned. Okay, where do you want to begin?
There's so many topics that Stephen's raised there. So, and I want to try and cover them all. So you'll have to bring me back if I forget one or another. So I want to go back. So first off, he quoted Alex Vilenkin, and I think that's a misquote because Alex Vilenkin doesn't believe in a God, right? He believes that the universe does have a beginning, but it doesn't need a cause. Right. Okay, so he has this. He does mention like where could the laws of physics be written? I think that was honestly a bit of a
turn of phrase.
It's a turn of phrase. Well,
I thought it was an insightful rhetorical question.
Hang on. I think
never claimed that he believed in God.
Okay,
nor does my argument
make that
depend
clear.
on what he.
Right, let's make that clear because when you have that comment, it sort of hints at, he's thinking there's a mind. He's not thinking that. In fact, if you read his book, Many Worlds in One, is incredibly anti all of the arguments that Stephen and other theists put forward. He basically, although he thinks the universe had a beginning, he doesn't think it needs a cause. So out with the clam. He also thinks like the multiverse is real and solves fine-tuning, so out with the fine-tuning argument. And people often quote Alex Vilenkin and don't quote this fact. It just seems incredibly unfair.
You feel it's a bit selective.
Yeah, it is. Now, hang on, Stephen, I didn't interrupt you, right?
Let's keep going.
Okay, now, let's talk about the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin Theorem. What I've actually sat in Guth's office and Vilenkin's office and asked them about this, right? First off, I can say, and I think maybe we can clear this up, that it's pronounced Border, not bored. Okay, everyone seems to pronounce right. But I got that from Alan Guth, and I think he knows how to pronounce his colleague's name. Okay, so if I slip up and say Borde or Borde, please correct me. So, okay, what does this theorem say? Okay, it just, basically what's going on is that they came up with this theory called inflation. So Alan Guth came up with this theory called inflation, which has this accelerated expansion.
In the very early moments of the universe.
This
inflationary period.
Yeah. And it was thought by Vilenkin, actually, he was one of the pioneers of this, to be eternal into the future. So once inflation starts, it never stops. It makes universe after universe after universe. So it's eternal. So they asked the question, well, if it's eternal into the future, can it be eternal into the past? And their conclusion was, no, it cannot be eternal into the past. So inflation requires a beginning. And what's in the paper is that there's a boundary to the inflating space. Okay. Now, first off, other people have challenged that. This is not like an agreed upon fact by everyone. There's a recent paper by Lesniewski, Davis and Essen saying actually they made a mistake, and it's actually you can have an inflating space that goes back into past. There are other papers that have said this. Now, again, the point I want to emphasize is no empirical way to adjudicate this disagreement. Okay, if inflation happened and it's eternal, and suppose there's some beginning to eternal inflation, we are not going to see it empirically. So that puts caution on this conclusion, right? Because we want science to be empirical. This is kind of why I think we need to emphasize the uncertainty here. We're in much more uncertainty about these topics than it would appear, right? We don't know if inflation, even happened. I think there's a good case to be made for inflation, but it's not watertight, all right? It's reasonable. But in the book, we go over a whole fights about it, for arguments for and against inflation. And I often change my mind about it every other day. It's a difficult topic, right? Okay. But even if inflation did have a beginning, okay, so something could have come before inflation, right? It doesn't have to be something abstract. It could just be simple. There was a collapsing universe and then there was an expanding universe.
This is where other models come in. There are other options on the table.
Right, and we don't know which one is correct. So basically, we have to be agnostic about these sorts of issues, right? It's just not correct to say that these points are beginning. In fact, Alan Guth thinks the universe is eternal into the past, right? And surely Stephen knows this, right? I mean, this is very well known.
And so from your perspective, Phil, what you're dealing here is that there's lots of different people with different perspectives, some of which might indicate a beginning, but that doesn't necessarily mean a God beginning. It could be there's some other formulation which suggests there's something else happening in the quantum realm, whatever it might be.
Right. So let's just take an example. Suppose you get a collapsing universe that expands. Right. Okay. I don't say what on earth is immaterial about that. I mean, it seems
this doesn't have any theistic implications.
I don't know what the theistic implication is supposed to be of that. Like, why is that
right?
Pointing to theory. No one's saying this is right.
Yeah,
this is one option.
But it's a plausible option among the options.
May I?
Right.
This is right on point. Okay.
Okay. So, do you mind if we go back to Steve?
Yeah. Can I answer this thing about inputting information?
Shall we come?
Okay, we'll
let's
come back
do one
to
thing at a time. We'll come back to information as well. But we're on Borde-Guth-Vilenkin.
Border.
Sorry,
yeah.
Borde-Guth.
Think of the border between
Thank you for eliminating the pronunciation.
Yeah, and
pronunciation.
The inflation, and Vilenkin certainly seems to have said this implies a beginning. Although,
well, wait a minute. When I sat in Vilenkin's office, in his popular book, he said that this was a proof of the beginning.
Right.
That was in a popular book, not in a scientific paper.
Okay.
Right. And when I asked him about it years later, he backed off that claim. He said, no, it only proves that inflation had a beginning. When I asked Guth, he said, no, this only proves inflation had a beginning. It doesn't say that the universe had a beginning.
So we're going to distinguish between inflation and the universe.
When they quote this theorem, when they quote Vilenkin, right, and they don't quote what they say now, which is that these theorems only say that inflation had a beginning, how does that prove that the universe had a beginning?
We've had a whole problem of taking him out of context on the other side, because I think he wrote an article in the journal Inference, edited by my colleague David Berlinski, where he was very clear. He thinks the universe probably did have a beginning, that the models that circumvent the BGV theorem are all the models that imply an eternal past are all problematic. And so on balance, yes, it's in the strict sense, it only establishes that inflationary Big Bang had a beginning. That if the universe is on average expanding from a beginning point, you can take it back that far. There are models that obviously propose a pre-Big Bang contraction, for example, the Steinhardt model, and that is a good one to illustrate my point. Okay, because in the Steinhardt model, first of all, there have been papers come out now that Steinhardt has conceded that his model, his cyclic ectopic model, does require ekpyrotic, thank you, model also is subject to BGV. But the idea is you can't go back. The model, the BGV theorem takes you back to the point where inflation starts. What happens before that? Well, there are contracting models. There was a previous phase and the universe was contracting. In Steinhardt's work, he posits a unique field that changes the energy density of the universe from positive to negative and back again. Now, there's no other field in our knowledge of physics that does something like that. So one of the epistemic costs of these alternative cosmologies is often a gross violation of Occam's razor in that they multiply theoretical entities, and often very imaginatively so. But in order to get the contraction phase to work just right, so it smooths out the background radiation so that you get a homogeneous background radiation in the next phase, the mathematics has to be exquisitely finely tuned. And so if you have someone who is gerrymandering the mathematics to make the model work, that is a reflection of what would need to be taking place in nature, that it would itself need to be finely tuned. And my contention is that these alternative models to the Big Bang, the alternative models that get rid of a beginning, invariably have problems with unexplained fine-tuning or inputs of information. And the pre-Big Bang contraction phase of the Steinhardt model, which is cited as one of the model-specific exemptions to BGV, is subject to that very condition that I'm talking about. So there's a robustness to the argument that we're developing. We're not hanging it all on the singularity proofs or the observational astronomy. I think on balance they point in that direction to a beginning. But the point is to circumvent that conclusion, invariably very speculative models have to be invented. They actually have three epistemic costs. One, they usually affirm something that has theistic implications like unexplained fine-tuning. Secondly, they usually violate Occam's razor because there's a massive multiplication of theoretical entities. I list them all in the string inflationary model of explaining the multiverse in chapter 16, but I've seen this repeatedly in these cosmological models. And then thirdly, there's often either something completely unprecedented being asserted about how physics will work, or something that violates physics, basic physics, really well-established physics that we know. For example, Phil's co-author posits a return of the ether, a second dimension of time, and that the speed of light is no longer constant, and goes on to say that if he is allowed to add a second dimension of time to his depiction of the universe, that may imply that causality is not a fundamental property of the universe. Well, that's a high cost to pay to formulate a model that gets around the beginning.
That's really helpful. Okay, Phil, you might want to pick up on the information sort of being brought at the beginning sort of point here as well.
Okay,
as you respond to
so many points to go through. So first of all, I mean, the cyclic model of Steinhardt and Anna Eas has been working on this. Let's give her some credit too. And of course, it goes back to earlier work. Ekpyrotic model, right. So
is this the collapsing?
No, so there's a confusion. I think
Sorry.
Stevens just got confused here, right? What I was suggesting was there was a collapsing universe and an expanding universe. That does not imply a cyclic universe of Steinhardt and Eas. Not at all, right? It doesn't imply a cyclic universe.
I'm not sure which one you're talking about.
Well, indeed.
The point is that their model...
Yeah, but I'm not talking about their model.
Well, okay, but I'm talking about it because it illustrates my point well. Their model is a model specific, it has an exemption.
Sorry, Stephen, I didn't interrupt you.
Doesn't apply to
I didn't interrupt you, Stephen, so maybe if you could let me speak.
Okay,
right.
but regardless, so, you might want to speak to
right, I'm not.
this model.
I wasn't talking about the ekpyrotic model. What I was talking about is a collapse followed by expansion. Now, a cyclic universe of the ekpyrotic type has collapse, expansion, collapse, expansion, collapse, expansion. And to get that to work, right, there are other things that you need. I'm not talking about that. I wasn't referring to that. I didn't even mention that.
Do you concede that you need fine-tuning to get that model to work, though, in the mathematics?
That's a complicated answer. Let me sort of answer some of the points you made before going on to some other points, right?
Well, okay, just for clarification,
Stephen,
for me,
maybe stop interrupting.
I just was wanting your clarification, though, for me. Which model are you talking about with the collapse contraction?
Well, there's many models that would just have a collapse and an expansion. So it's like what we would call an hourglass model. So an example of this would be, let's say, loop quantum cosmology, right? So here, what you're doing, you're not trying to circumvent the beginning. That's the wrong language, okay? This is a lot of theists think that what cosmologists are trying to do, they know about the Kalam cosmological argument and it proves God's existence and they're trying to find a way around it. No, okay? Most cosmologists probably never heard of the Kalam cosmological argument. They don't care about any of these conversations. What they're trying to do is to extend the border of our knowledge, okay? So we get to the Big Bang and that's where our understanding stops, okay? But they want to push beyond it. So what they want to do is say, okay, let's develop quantum theories of gravity and apply them to the Big Bang and let's just see what happens. So I interviewed the people that worked on, let's say, loop quantum cosmology as an example, right? And what they did was they developed the theory over like decades before ever applying it to the Big Bang. Once they felt they had enough understanding of the theory that they could start to do this, then they applied it to the Big Bang. And what did they find? That the Big Bang becomes a big bounce. And there's a reason for this, because in the theory, you find that space has a maximum capacity. So think of a sponge, okay? You pour water on a sponge, the sponge absorbs the water. In a similar way, space can absorb energy as you start to compress it. But what happens is, as the water gets poured on the sponge, eventually the sponge gets filled up. It can no longer absorb the water. So rather than becoming water absorbent, it becomes water repellent. So similarly, space in this scenario bounces out because it's got filled up. Simple as that. So basically what you do is you find that the Big Bang is, in effect, the Big Bang singularity is replaced by a big bounce. So there was a contracting universe on the other side. Now it's true in the cyclic model of Steinhardt and EAS, they have to assume 2 additional fields. But of course, assuming additional fields is not like some bizarre, weird thing. This happens all the time in physics. The Higgs field is Stephen going to say the Higgs field was some conflict with Occam rays? When you have a problem, you come up with novel solutions. This is what science does. This is completely normal in science. And if you thought this was a great problem, you'd be stopping science in a sense, because scientists are often coming up with novel solutions to stuff. So this is
it's not about circumventing anything. It's about just testing different ideas, creative ideas.
It's trying to come up with better than what we've got and then seeing what it does.
Yeah.
Now, if you find that it solves certain problems and there are certain reasons to take it seriously. So, for example, if we stay in the loop quantum gravity case, I'm not saying loop quantum gravity is right. Okay, it's got problems. Every theory has problems, including ones with a beginning and ones without a beginning. Every theory has problems. That's why we're writing a book about how people are battling about them. All theories have problems. What does that really tell us? It just tells us that our theories are incomplete, right? That we don't know what's happening. And this is kind of the whole point of the argument here. We don't know what's going on in the early universe. So we can't make any firm conclusions, right? But there's no reason to think that these ideas require a God, right? It doesn't point to anything other than a lack of our understanding. And we try and push forward. It might be that nature doesn't allow us to go
and presumably for you, just before we come back to you, Steve, you believe that, I think we'll need to get to this, towards the end of our conversation. You presumably believe that God is a very unsatisfactory explanation compared to continuing to explore physical, mathematical, other types of
I don't believe any of the models in our book, okay. Right? And the reason is because I won't believe it until it's made really precise predictions that have been tested thoroughly against observations. So what people in this field are trying to do that. Now, at the moment, it's simplified models. There's nothing, I think, absolutely compelling. I mean, if you survey cosmologists, and in fact, we have surveyed cosmologists, certainly about inflation versus alternatives, because that's one debate. And then even if you think inflation happened, you can ask what happened before, right? So inflation is the most popular model, right? Arguably, it is actually a pre-Big Bang model. In fact, Guth talks about it that way. But we don't know. I don't think there's anything convincing, right? So we basically should be agnostic. Right? And if we're lucky, we will be able to push beyond. But it's possible that nature's just put up a brick wall and we'll never know. Right? In fact, there's a theorem called Melvin-Manchek theorem, which says we can't ever know the global structure of space-time. If that's right, maybe we're never going to know. But I'm a bit more optimistic than that. But it does say, I think, that you couldn't observationally tell the global structure of space-time. But here's the important point. Actually, let me address this issue about putting the information in.
Okay, let's do that, and then we will pass it back to Steve.
So it's true that equations often have infinite number of solutions. So if you just think of a really simple equation like x plus y equals 2, there's an infinite number of solutions to that equation, right? It could be 1 + 1 = 2.
1.5 plus 0.5.
Exactly. There's an infinite number of solutions. It could be 3 ± -1, right? So now when you go to the real world, what you find is that often these things get constrained by the regularities that exist in nature. So imagine what we're actually trying to describe is apples falling off a tree. Okay, so let's suppose we have some detector and it can detect a sound of something falling, but it can't tell how many apples. But we know there were 2 incidents. So now our equation is x + y = 2, right? Oh, actually, it has to be 1 + 1 because there can't be a negative number of apples, and there can't be actually from what we know about apples, there's not when they fall off trees, they're whole apples. So actually, the infinite number of solutions collapses down to like one unique solution. Okay, now. In field theories, it's true that there are an infinite number of solutions to those equations, right? So how do you make progress? Well, you impose symmetry. One way you can do it is impose symmetries, right? And then you see what you get. Now, a lot of the symmetries might be justifiable by empiricism. So we look at the universe and we see it's homogeneous. So, okay, let's impose that as a symmetry. So what physicists are doing is trying to make progress. It's true that they have to make assumptions. The God theory has to make assumptions. You have to make assumptions about what God would do, whether he's good, what kind of universe he would create. No one can get out of making assumptions, right? But what you do is you have this feedback in cosmology. We don't believe, even if you make assumptions and you get a plausible idea, right? So I think inflation is plausible, right? But we don't believe it until it's got through the incredible number of robust tests. And I think I don't want to endorse any theory, be it God or a big bounce or holographic cosmology, which actually I don't think holographic cosmology does need a Wheeler-DeWitt equation. You don't use the Wheeler-DeWitt equation. You use
I'm saying it's used in quantum cosmology.
Right. So the bottom line is, yes, people make assumptions. This is what you have to do physics. And it's nothing unusual. Coming up with new fields is nothing unusual. It's been done before. That's what the Higgs field was. This is part of doing science.
Okay. All right. So
a couple of points.
Let's have some further thoughts. And I'm going to start to bring this into land so we can also talk about our other big issue, which is the fine-tuning of the universe for life and whether that lends evidence for the God hypothesis.
Right. A minute ago, Phil said that we have a lot of confusion about what was going on in the early universe. The word early implies that the universe was near the beginning of its beginning. And the multiplication of these very abstract models that do circumvent the beginning, I think is evidence not of progress in physics, but of a kind of degenerate research program. That Thomas Kuhn, the historian of science, said that when you see a multiplication of modeling, you're not seeing a healthy research program that's making progress. If there are 25 different models, they're mainly inconsistent with each other. If they require many ad hoc assumptions, a multiplication of explanatory entities, this is not evidence of making progress. What he inadvertently said in referring to the universe as having an early state is the most natural thing that most people think, even in physics, when they're thinking about how the universe began. There was a Big Bang. And so what's taking place is these models are attempting to eliminate the idea that there was a single beginning. There are 2 basic types. Either you get the quantum approach, the quantum cosmological approach that wants to portray the early universe as a quantum state in superposition of these mathematical possibilities. Or you have either some type of oscillating or cyclic where you have multiple Big Bangs. And Phil interviewed Sir Roger recently. He has this cyclic conformal model. He posits fields that have, again, properties that no other fields have. He has to have exquisite fine-tuning after the crossover from the expansion phase of the universe to a new phase where you have massive entropy, and it's by a kind of mathematical sleight of hand. He reduces that with what he calls scale invariance, and then somehow that massive universe that had lots and lots of entropy is now a universe in a low entropy state with lots of energy available to do work simply because he's measuring it differently. And then once the universe begins to expand, it has to be the right amount of mass of the right kind has to be introduced by a new type of field. He used to call it a phantom field. Now it's a field of unnamed that's producing particles called error-bonds that again have features that no other massive particles have in physics. So what you're seeing, I think, is not a healthy research program, but a proliferation of highly speculative models that are getting around that very obvious conclusion that if there was an early universe, early with respect to what? Early with respect to its beginning. And it would, I think, be much better to simply acknowledge that there was a beginning and proceed in physics research based on that assumption rather than the multiplication of modeling that is...
What about Phil's contention here that, this has always been the way of science. People try different things. They get creative. They put out different hypotheses. Inevitably, some of these are going to be difficult to test because of the nature of the
But absolutely, there's nothing wrong with modeling. The point is, what does the modeling show you when you look at it carefully? It's showing that you have to violate Occam's razor with multiple explanatory entities. And invariably, to make the models work, you have to have exquisite fine-tuning. You can't get a universe like ours with specificity of features without constraining possibility space mathematically. And so the fine-tuning, it becomes an inevitable consequence of these models that eliminate a beginning. And so that provides, I think, a basis for a different form of the cosmological argument, an argument from contingency, but still a very powerful pointer to God. You either have a God argument if you start with the assumption of a beginning, with the evidence for a beginning, or if you circumvent that, go in a different direction, model a non-beginning universe, you have to compensate for that with exquisite fine-tuning. And I would assert, and I think I can show, that you find that fine-tuning in each of these models. And it's not something that explained within the structure of the model, within the structure of the mathematics of the model. It's imposed extrinsically by the modeler. And that's the input of information I'm talking about that is, I think, being inadvertently I think that input of information from the modeler is inadvertently revealing what's necessary to make a universe, which is an input of information or fine-tuning.
Quick response, and then I'm going to get you to do the trying to understand each other thing. Okay, so quick response.
Okay, so notice that Stephen didn't reply to my point about, let's say, the loop quantum cosmology model. Okay, what was going on there? Nothing metaphysical about it. It's just a collapsing universe and an expanding universe. There's no need for the extra fields that you have in the aporotic model, right? Also notice that there's no reply to the issue of what does the BGB theorem really prove, right? One thing I should point out, that it's also based off of particle picture of reality, but we don't think that when we get back to the early universe, we have a particle picture. It's a field picture. Now, when I say early universe, I'm just talking about the hot, dense state, okay? Because this is the language that we use, okay? It doesn't mean, as we said, we can actually show you what physicists think. Okay, and they don't think that the Big Bang was necessarily a beginning. So but yet they talk about early universe. It's just a turn of phrase, right? The idea of making something big about that. Now he says, well, there's all these like exotic ideas out there. Now, of course, the cost of the ideas depends on what they have in each case. So, for example, we challenge the idea that you could have a variable speed of light. You might say that's like an incredibly bizarre assumption. Okay, why would you think that? Well, there are reasons to think that. There's a theory called Hodge-Lifshitz gravity. It's a proposal for quantum gravity, and there's a reason to take it seriously. I'm not saying it's right, but there's a reason to take it seriously.
But that's a kind of dodge. I'm sorry, Phil. That's a kind of dodge to say I don't take any of the models to be correct, but the very fact of these possibly incorrect models shows that the universe didn't have a beginning.
No, I'm not saying that, Stephen. That's a complete mischaracterization of what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that we don't know what the correct description of quantum gravity is, okay? Therefore, we cannot make any firm conclusions about whether there was a beginning. Therefore, the singularity theorems which rely on Einstein's theory of gravity or a classical space-time picture, and the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem does require, all right, a classical space-time picture. And it also requires that the speed of light can't be violated. Well, if Hodge-Lifshitz gravity is true, then the speed of light...
It does not require a quantum gravitational theory.
It's a classical picture of space-time. It absolutely is.
It's based on special relativity, not based on general relativity.
No, but it still
so
requires
the fact that general relativity doesn't apply.
It still requires a classical space-time. It still has a particle picture of reality, right? This is something well agreed upon. Okay. Now, the point is, yes, you posit new things. This happens all the time in physics. Okay. And then what you do is you have this feedback with experiment. So what experimental evidence does the God theory make? Does it predict? So here's a claim made by inflation cosmologists. And in fact, I think that, Stephen very much mischaracterizing this, but so there are simple models of inflation and they claim to make predictions for, let's say, the degree of scale invariance or gravitational waves and things like this. And in our book, we talk about some of these possible tests. And at the end of the book, I don't want to reveal the ending, but we think there's a much more definitive test that happens. Okay, and the point is we don't believe these theories until these definitive tests have been done. So what does God say about the level of scale invariance or the strength of gravitational waves or whether they're tilted blue or red? As far as I can see, nothing, right? It's very easy to say, I assume a being that could do anything and then it can explain anything, right? Okay, of course you can. But I say that we don't believe any theory until they've been tested. Now, that doesn't mean that something can't have some degree of plausibility. And I think that some of these ideas like string theory, like loop quantum gravity, like causal set theory, they have reasons to take them seriously. So for example, there are infinities in our equations that can be solved, right? Which you can't do in general relativity. The equations blow up. And in these approaches, equations don't blow up. So that is a reason to take them seriously. It's not a reason to say that they're true, but it means that I think, therefore, when you get this, that is a sign of progress.
Okay.
Because, oh my God, there were equations that couldn't be solved, now they can be solved. There's a singularity that couldn't be resolved. Oh, we actually show that we can resolve a singularity. I think that's progress. It's far from the end of the journey, right? We need those empirical tests. And until then, we don't say what's right. And I think what's happening with the theist is they don't have anything like a mathematical description of what God would do. They don't have any predictions, but yet they're assenting to that theory. Well, I'd like
to hear Steve respond to that, because I think this takes us into the important question of
let's
the
be clear about what's
God.
going on theoretically. You go back to, as far as we can go empirically, to the beginning of the expansion, and what all of the models that are described in the book are doing is modeling what came before that. And so there is every bit as much of a boundary empirically to the naturalist or materialist cosmologist as to what precedes the Big Bang as there is to the theist who posits a creator. All of these models are full of unobservables, unobservable fields, unobservable physics, unobservable processes that are exquisitely finely tuned. What theism expects, there's a wonderful quote from Dawkins, who I guess you interviewed yesterday. He said that the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if at bottom there's no purpose, no design, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. What's implied in that is that metaphysical systems, materialism, theism, are every bit as testable by comparing what you would expect to see given the hypothesis as our scientific hypotheses. I think what we have in these formulations of pre-Big Bang cosmologies is a form of mathematized materialistic metaphysics. And that the proliferation of these models doesn't show that a promising research program, but the opposite. And that there are things that you would expect to see in the universe that we see in physics that invariably cannot be explained within these models. And one of those key things is fine-tuning. This is something that agents do that natural processes don't do. If you have a vast ensemble of possibilities, and only one or very few of those possibilities is necessary to achieve a propitious outcome, whether we're talking about a French recipe or an internal combustion engine or you name it, these are things that we know minds produce. And in all of the naturalistic cosmologies, we have a transcendent dimension, something separate from this universe, Theists agree you need a transcendent dimension, but what's missing in all the pre-Big Bang naturalistic cosmologies is an entity which can fine-tune a system. That fine-tuning is always modeled by the physicists as they gerrymander the equations. And so that's an expectation, a prediction of theism that is present in the physics that's not expected on...
And this is to answer Phil's objection
Yes.
that God is not an adequate sort of testable
He wants to say it has no
hypothesis.
empirical content, and I'm saying no, it does. And the very thing that these models invariably cannot explain is the very thing that theism expects, which is present in all of the models.
Right. We're going to take a pause just for a moment, because this is fantastic. I'm racing to keep up with all of this, but I think I'm there. I'm going to ask you both to just at this point where, because I think this is a natural point to maybe start to transition into our other big topic, the fine-tuning of the universe, and we'll do as much justice as we can to that in the time we've got. But maybe I'll start with you, Phil. Could you give for me, as best you can, where what your understanding is of what Steve is saying here, as regards to why he really does think you are entitled to posit God in light of the physics? I understand this will not be your view. You are, if you like, playing devil's advocate to Steve here. But what do you understand to be saying as far as our conversation has got so far?
Right. So he's basically saying, well, all the different quantum cosmology models imply something transcendent, which I think is completely false.
We know
Right?
you think that, but let's just hear what you...
Right,
what
they
you-
don't. But that's what he
think.
thinks.
That's
Okay.
what he thinks.
Right. Okay. Then he says, well, they all need a mind to model them. Again, this is just normal physics. There's nothing bizarre about this. But he says, well, they need information input, right? And that's done by a mind, right? But it's always done by a physical mind, by the way. It's never done by an immaterial mind, right? Okay. But therefore, this is evidence for theism. Then he says, okay, all these models require fine-tuning, okay? I don't know that they do, or I don't know what the fine-tuning is supposed to be in holographic cosmology, for example, but okay. But even if they do, that just means there's something more to be learned. It's ridiculous to demand that a theory has to explain every mystery in physics, right? So of course there are unexplained things. That's how we make progress in science. We don't try and solve everything at once. We try and say, well, this is a problem, let's try and fix this. And Stephen thinks that in doing that, you'd have unsolved problems that are still, therefore, fine-tuning, and therefore God and theism predicts fine-tuning, and therefore that's evidence of theism.
All right. I'm going to ask, are you satisfied with that?
Well,
that explanation.
It's a rather pejorative framing of the terminology and everything else, but good enough for Governor Brierley.
All right, good enough to go on for now. Okay, what?
I would just
do the same.
Invite
back
viewers to read, for example, chapters 17 and 18 in my book to
Okay.
illustrate the depth of this need for unexplained fine-tuning or information inputs. It's implicit in these models. And one of the things I appreciate about their book is that the exposition is so clear that it really reveals where that fine-tuning is being excluded from where it's a necessary feature of the success of the model.
Right.
And
that's your perspective on it. Just again, if you wouldn't mind doing the same process, what are you hearing from Phil so far as regards why he just doesn't see God as needing to be brought into this conversation?
Yeah, he's saying that we have a lot of uncertainty about the early state of the universe, that it's natural, therefore, that scientists would be developing other models to try to explain its origin, and that this is a healthy part of science to develop such models. He's also saying that he doesn't affirm or necessarily agree with any of them, and doesn't think there's one to hang his hat on at this point. But the fact of those other models suggests that there's no need to come to the conclusion that there was a beginning to the universe, or that there is any other evidence that points towards a mind behind the universe.
Is that
It's close enough, but remember the point that we don't have any empirical observations for singularity, and we can't trust the theorems. Therefore, I would just say, don't worry about the models. They're fun. They're really interesting to learn about. But the point is, the existing statement that the universe had a beginning just can't be trusted.
Right.
That's really the bottom line.
Whereas obviously Steve feels that in totality he just comes to a very different conclusion, that he thinks that there is enough evidence from different points of view to say it's a reasonable conclusion. Hello again. If you'd like to see more of these conversations from Uncommon Ground, please do consider becoming a monthly supporter. Monthly supporters get some perks too. Silver supporters get early access to new episodes plus bonus content from Think Faith. Gold supporters get all of that, plus the chance for a monthly catch-up with me and signed copies of both of my books, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God and Why I'm Still a Christian. Find the link to support from today's video and help me make more conversations that matter. Okay, let's talk about our next big issue. This is the second big sort of scientific discovery that you talk about in Return of the God Hypothesis, Steve. And it's the fine-tuning of the universe for life, this idea that it appears that there are a certain number of cosmological sort of factors, values, laws, numbers that are precisely dialed to the values they need to be in order for life to appear in the cosmos. Sketch out the big picture here and why it, for you, lends evidence to the idea.
Right. Well, the idea of fine-tuning is that there are a number of parameters that fall within very narrow ranges, outside of which life and even stable galaxies and even basic chemistry would be impossible. And the existence of those extremely finely tuned parameters and their importance for there being a life-friendly universe provides evidence of a fine-tuner. And this is the idea in the theistic argument is that we have a lot of ordinary experience. Our uniform and repeated experience, which is the basis of all scientific reasoning, shows that when we see finely tuned systems, invariably they are the product of a mind, whether we're talking about a French recipe or an internal combustion engine or the way in which a piece of software runs a piece of hardware, that type of fine-tuning where there's a vast ensemble of possibilities, only very few of which will yield a propitious outcome. Those are systems which invariably are the products of mind. And so when we see that feature of a vast ensemble of possibilities, only very few of which will yield a life-friendly universe, it is a natural conclusion based on our ordinary experience of cause and effect to infer that there was a designing intelligence. Thus, for example, Sir Fred Hoyle, who was one of the first scientists to discover some of the fundamental fine-tuning parameters, those related to the formation of carbon in the universe, said that a common sense interpretation of the data suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics. And
blind chance is not something worth speaking of. Yeah. I mean, give us an example of one of these apart from Fred Hoyle.
We've been talking in a cosmological context. We have an expanding universe.
Yeah.
Where I argue from a beginning that expansion is fine-tuned and accepted value is about 1 part in 10 to the 90th power.
So if it differed from that value by 1 part in 10 to the 90, we'd
either get a heat death or we get a big crunch.
Okay. So something that's inhospitable to the possibility of life.
And another thing to say about the fine-tuning is there are different classes of fine-tuning evidence. Okay. There's the fine-tuning of the strength of the fundamental forces measured by their constants. I explain what the constants of physics are in the book, but so there's the fine-tuning of the laws and constants of physics, but there's also the fine-tuning of the initial conditions of the universe, the configuration of mass energy at the Big Bang going forward. And there are multiple parameters, but there are at least 2 different categories or types of fine-tuning. And some of the different models that have been proposed to explain the fine-tuning will explain one class but not the other, or the other and not the one. And so that's another thing to keep in mind.
Okay. And so for you, this again is part of an overall case for why God...
It's a sign of intelligence.
It's a sign of intelligence.
When we find finely tuned systems, we can look around the room, find any number of them. We should apply
the same reasoning to
We should apply the same
universe.
reasoning and realize that there's a mind behind it.
And I have to say, Phil, this, even among many of the atheist sort of thinkers I've spoken to, Richard Dawkins, Peter Millikan, others, they've often said, actually, if there's one argument that has given me pause for thought, the fine-tuning of the universe is pretty remarkable. Now, do you in any way sort of question the fact of fine-tuning, even if you perhaps are going to go in a different direction in terms of explaining that fine-tuning?
Well, I think it's better for me to reveal not what I think, but what physicists think,
Okay.
because I've done some surveys with physicists
All right, go
about
ahead.
what they think. So how about we do
Yeah,
that?
let's find out.
Okay, so I'd done 2 surveys. One was at a conference in Copenhagen, organized by the Niels Bohr Institute, had leading physicists there. And so that was, very, very high, top names in the field, but a smaller sample size. So I think we had about 80 replies. We've then teamed up with the American Physical Society, and we've done what I think is the largest survey of physicists ever. I think it's about roughly 1,700 replies we've got. So why don't I reveal what the results are?
Okay, you've
Because
come
I've
prepared.
I've come prepared.
Yes.
So this is what physicists actually think. So let's start with the Copenhagen survey, which we've actually published now. The other one has not been published yet, but I hope by the time this goes out, it will be. Okay, so we gave them various options to explain the fine-tuning, and I'm going to go from the bottom up. Okay, and one thing to put this in perspective is just consider how many scientists believe in God. Okay, so there have been a lot of surveys done in the US, because that's where we have data, so that's what I'm going to quote. For the general population, it varies survey to survey, but it's something like 70 to 85% believe in God. For scientists as a whole, again, it varies a bit, so it's something between 30 and 40%. So it's a big drop. And then when you go to what are called the eminent scientists, the top people in the field, they surveyed, let's say, members of the National Academy of Science. They got, I think, 7% believed in God. So another big drop. Okay, so here are the results from our Copenhagen survey. The least popular option by the scientists was selected as the intelligent design option. It got 3% support. Now notice that's much, much lower than even the numbers that believe in God from the other survey, right? It's less than half. So that got 3%. The next one was necessity. So this is the idea that the constants are just have to be what they are.
Right.
So there's no point arguing about, how improbable they are, that there's some mathematical reason why they have to be what they are. You might not know what it is,
And
but you think
how many took that?
So that got 9%. Okay. The next was a Darwinian selection.
Okay.
So that got 10%. So the idea here is, we've seen this problem before. If you throw genes together randomly, you're not going to get a functional organism. And I think most scientists think that Darwin solved that problem. Now, obviously, Stephen doesn't think so. So this one's not going to be popular with him. But the idea is
kind of Darwinian on a more sort of...
Yeah, the idea is that the universe can reproduce itself.
I see.
Okay, so one way that's like, for example, Lee Smolin's come up with a particular mechanism, but you could imagine other mechanisms. But the idea in Smolin's model is that a black hole could give birth to a new universe. So if singularities are replaced by bounces, which seems to be implied by some models,
which is
of quantum
taking us
gravity,
back to our previous conversation, but there's some explanation in the evolution of the universe in
a
previous
Darwinian
states
sense.
that allow that we find ourselves in one that is.
Yeah, it selects for ones that can reproduce themselves. So it's selecting for more black holes, not for life. Life just becomes a sort of happy byproduct.
Okay.
So that's Darwinian selection. So that got 10%. Okay. So number 2, I've admitted here no opinion and other. Okay. Number 2, do you want to guess what number 2 was?
A multiverse?
Yes.
Okay.
Multiverse was number 2. Okay, so that got 24%.
And just again, just for the sake of those who perhaps don't know what we're talking about in that regard, could you perhaps briefly explain the multiverse hypothesis?
Yeah, so we actually say it's anthropic selection in a multiverse. So multiverse is that it's like, imagine the lottery, right? Super unlikely that someone wins a lottery unless lots of lottery tickets are sold. If lots of lottery tickets are sold, quite likely that someone wins the lottery. And then the anthropic selection comes in, whereby, so the idea is you could only observe the universe that has life-emitting values. So there's a selection bias. It's not what's the most likely universe. Our universe could be incredibly unlikely. It's what's the most likely universe to be observed, because you have to observe the one that's life-emitting. So that's why we call it anthropic selection in a multiverse, right?
So that was the second most popular sort of way of making sense of fine-tuning of the universe for life.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Yeah.
And what was the number 1 then?
Any guess?
I don't know.
Go on.
Okay. It's that the constant nature are brute facts that need no further explanation. That there's nothing to be explained
And that's
here.
different
Go away.
to them being necessary.
Yeah. No, so necessary is different to a brute fact.
Okay.
So necessary means they have to be what they are. So imagine like a coin flip,
Okay.
right? So you could take a coin flip and say, okay, it could land heads or tails. It landed heads. What's the grand metaphysical explanation for that? There isn't none. Just deal with it. It landed heads.
Okay.
Who cares, right? It's heads. That's what it came out
It's a brute
as.
fact.
And so it's just a brute fact. It's not that it had to come out heads, whereas necessity means it has to come out heads.
Okay.
Right? There's some reason why it had to come out heads. Right? So that was our survey of the experts.
Interesting.
Then when we did the American Physical Society, that's much broader, much broader. We had 1,700 replies, and so the results are pretty similar. Okay, they're not radically different. So intelligent design, I expected to be. I thought, well, look, the population of elite scientists, let's say, is 7% believing in God, and the broader scientific community is maybe 35% believing in God. So I thought it would go up by 5, but it only went up by 3. It was 9% belief in intelligent design. Okay, so it was number 2 from the bottom rather than number 1 from the bottom, rather than at the bottom. Okay, then necessity actually was the one that got the biggest boost.
Okay.
Now we actually rephrased it. I should because when we spoke to the American Physical Society, we went, necessity is a philosophical term. So we rephrased it to, there's a principle that sort of forbids fine-tuning.
Yeah, the laws are producing their own fine-tuning parameters.
Well, it's that there's some reason why
the contingent features of the laws, whether it be their initial conditions.
Well, we don't say that, because it's more that there's a reason why they have to take on the values that they do, coming from physics.
Okay.
Right. So that got 19%. So that got the biggest difference between the professionals and the broader one. Then Darwinian selection had 6% rather than 10%, and multiverse went down a little bit, 24% to 21%, and yet again brute facts was up on top.
Okay, interesting.
Now here's one of the important thing I want to take away from this, okay? Because we're often told that you have to choose between an intelligent designer or a multiverse, okay? And this is what physics is telling us, okay? But if you actually ask physicists what they think that neither of these two options is well, if you add up those two in both surveys, they came to less than a third.
Right.
Less than a third back that option, right? And so actually physicists don't think you need to appeal to intelligent designer or a multiverse, not by a majority. I mean, some do, obviously, right? So this is important, because the narrative that we're being told is that these are your two choices. And in fact, many physicists think that's not correct.
Okay. I'd just be interested in your response to this interesting survey that
Sure.
was done.
I think it's an argument from authority, and it's an argument ad populum. Okay, we're going to take a vote, right? Nothing in what was said responded to the basic logic of the fine-tuning argument, which is that when we find fine-tuning as a feature of systems, and we know how they arose, they invariably arose from the activity of an intelligent mind. So we could identify to see if the consensus view of the scientists that there's nothing there to be explained, whether they would apply that reasoning to any other fine-tuned system that we might see in, say, our terrestrial environment. If a section of software had to be very finely tuned to produce a certain programming output, would we say, well, the software is just a brute fact of the system, or would we want instead to attribute it to a programmer? Similarly, if we saw that there were a whole lot of ways of arranging the parts of an internal combustion engine, but only very few of those configured just right will result in the engine working, would we want to say there's nothing there to explain? I think if we're going to appeal to the consensus of a community, we also need to be aware of what the assumptions of the community are about how they are to practice their discipline. And this applies to both materialist and theistic scientists. And that is that there's been a long-standing convention in science from about the late 19th century, soon after the Darwinian Revolution, that science must limit itself to materialistic explanations only. It has a fancy name. It's called the principle of methodological naturalism. I think it's very much at work in the proliferation of naturalistic pre-Big Bang models, all the things we were talking about. But many scientists have been quite open and honest about the role of this convention in affecting their own thinking about the God question. For example, Richard Lewontin, the really famous Harvard evolutionary biologist, was quoted several years ago as saying, we take the side of science He's talking about the historic conflict between science and religion. He said, we take the side of science in spite of its many counterintuitive constructs, in sight of its unsubstantiated just so stories. Think the multiverse, for example, because we have a prior commitment to materialism. And he said that commitment is absolute. We cannot allow a divine foot in the door. So you have something like the fine-tuning evidence, which, as I've argued in the previous session, occurs repeatedly in attempts to model the universe without a beginning. So you've got this very fundamental feature of reality that we recurringly encounter. And rather than saying something needs to be explained, or we say nothing needs to be explained, or we come up with a multiverse theory, and yes, intelligent design is at the bottom of the heap, but it's at the bottom of the heap among a community of people who accept that it is their duty as scientists to limit themselves to strictly materialistic explanations only. So I don't think we can assess the rationality of the fine-tuning argument by an appeal to the consensus of the community.
And in a sense, I'm also hearing here that good scientists don't always make good philosophers of science. There may be some extra
they absolutely,
that needs to be done.
Do not.
And so just polling is... So what do you find...
But notice when you poll philosophers,
yes,
the brute facts was the number one
okay, well,
view
that's interesting.
So you can't appeal to philosophical ignorance. No, hang on.
It's appeal. You're appealing
Stephen.
to a consensus.
No, I'm not. Okay, because I'm not saying you have to believe in brute facts because that's most popular. I'm not saying that. But what I'm trying to do is to correct the narrative, because of course notice that when Stephen opened his argument up, he appealed to Fred Hoyle as a great physicist. No question he was.
He was also the discoverer of the first set of fine-tuning
please don't interrupt. I didn't interrupt you, right? Okay, right. So people appeal to authorities when defending the fine-tuning argument, and I think it's worthwhile pointing out what physicists actually think. I certainly don't think any scientific disagreement can be decided by a poll. Obviously not, right? But what we can do is say, look, people are saying this is what physicists think, and they're misrepresenting what physicists think because they haven't actually done the research, and we have. Right?
Well, I'd push back on that. At the back of Luke Barnes's wonderful book written with his atheistic supervisor from Cambridge. He did his PhD at Cambridge in physics. He has a list of all the leading physicists who accept that fine-tuning is something that needs to be explained. And so that first explanation is that it's just a brute fact. Maybe many don't. But the fact of fine-tuning is something that's on the table. It's been established by leading physicists. But
it hasn't been established. This is something that's been disputed. This is the whole point.
All right, well, let's go there.
What we're trying to do here is that this has been disputed. Right.
So you're questioning the very...
Are you questioning the fact of fine-tuning, or that there's a need for an explanation of fine-tuning?
Well, it depends what you mean by the fact of fine-tuning. So don't forget that when physicists use the term fine-tuning, they don't always mean the definition that Stephen often gives, which is that it's improbable to have life-limiting values. A lot of time physicists use the term fine-tuning, they mean something else. They mean that a theory needs some parameter to have some unlikely value, for example. And so people question, what do you mean by unlikely, right? So the problem is that when we talk about probabilities have to come from somewhere, okay? So where do these probabilities come from? So a lot of people would say you can't do probabilities for things like this because you don't know the mechanisms whereby they are set. So if you take an example, let's say you throw a die, okay? You can say, 6 is just as likely as 1, it's just as likely as 2.
It's a 1 in 6 probability.
I can say probability of getting 6 is 1 in 6. How can I say that? What justifies that? Well, I know how many sides the dice have. Yes. Okay? I know that it's equally weighted. Okay, I know how many times I get to throw, because if I get to throw more times, then, different outcomes can be possible. I know how many dice there are. So think of the constant nature. Do we know how many sides there are on the dice? No, we don't. Right? We don't know how many values are actually possible. Right? So some people would challenge, you're assuming they could take on different values. Maybe they can't. Maybe there's some principle that puts them in one value rather than another. Or more broadly, we can just say we don't know how many sides are on the dice, nor do we know if they're equally weighted, nor do we know how many dice we have. So for example, if I have one die, I can use something called the principle of indifference. I can say each side of the die is equally likely. So if 6 comes up more often than 1 or more often than 2, something weird is going on. I'm justified in saying that, right? Because I have experience of dice and I understand how dice work, right? Now, for the constant nature, We don't have that. Now, and in fact, if you throw in another die, actually the principle of indifference that you use, give each possible outcome the same weight, actually doesn't work anymore. Because in fact, 1 is now impossible if you have 2 die. You can't roll a 1 if you have 2 die. And in fact, 6 becomes much more likely than 2, right? So that principle of indifference that you were using before, which is what's being used in the fine tuning or something like it.
I think I get the general idea though, that you're taking objection to Steve's idea that the specificity
it's a hard word to pronounce, isn't it? I keep listening up
of these numbers is improbable because you don't know what the conditions could have been. Otherwise, you don't know.
You don't know the mechanism that's generating the probability. So in fact, let me give an example that was used by a good guy called Chris Hitchcock. He's a professor of philosophy of physics, editor of the Oxford Handbook of philosophy of probability. Sorry, and he gives this example of a jar with beans in it. So you've got lentils and red beans, and you could say, look, a priori, so if I've got these red lentils and black beans, what if I shake them up, what's the probability that all the black beans will go to the top? Well, let's say I give them 1/2 probability because it could go to the bottom or the top, and there's 100 of them, and you get this extraordinary low probability. Then he shakes the jar up and all the red lentils go to the bottom, right? What's going on? Well, you understand the process. There's a force of gravity pulling them down, and the smaller ones go through the cracks in the bigger ones. So what you calculated a priori was this fantastically low probability, and it's got absolutely nothing to do with the real world because you didn't know the mechanism,
some of the other mechanisms
that would lead you. So if you don't know anything about dice, right? So suppose I'm just going to have a random number generator go between, let's say, 2 and 12. You might say, well, a priori, 6 is no more likely than 2. But when you learn something about how dice work, you find out, oh, actually, 6 is more likely than 2.
We're not justified, essentially, in saying this is improbable when we don't know what mechanism produced the values of the universe in the first place.
And the appeal in the example is to some sort of underlying law, in this case, the effect of gravity on the things in the jar, right? But the interesting feature about the basic parameters, the constants of nature, is that they are contingent features of the fundamental laws themselves, of the 4 fundamental force laws. And so because they are features of those laws, there's nothing more fundamental than those laws to appeal to in giving an explanation for why the values would be set necessarily in one place rather than another. So what might reduce the probability is an appeal to necessity, but I think that is the least plausible explanation for the incredible improbability or the setting of those fine-tuning parameters. If the parameters themselves are features of the laws, you can't refer to the laws as the explanation for the parameters. The argument I thought that Phil might make has to do with the probability, the probability being set if you have an infinite range. Okay, this is the objection that comes up more often. Well, if there's an infinite range of possibilities, then no matter how narrow the number is on the denominator, it's going to be undefined because anything divided by infinity is 0. Okay, that's something called the normalizability problem. It says we can't render meaningful probabilities, but there's been a lot of advances in physics on this issue. One is just some work that's been recently done by a Colombian mathematician at the University of Miami, showing that it's actually using non-standard analysis, you can generate meaningful measures of probability, even dealing with infinitesimals. But the other thing, and this is something that Luke Barnes and Robin Collins have shown, is that there are natural ranges that allow us to calculate probabilities because the ranges are, all discussions of fine-tuning parameters are defined in relation to the standard model of particle physics. And that has both upper and lower limits for most of the key parameters. And so there are not infinite ranges of possible values, but finite ranges. And those natural ranges also help with the question of, well, what if the probabilities are not equiprobable? We do know that there are underlying physical processes that might play a role, but when you get to the fundamental physical processes, there's nothing more fundamental that can determine what the contingent features of those laws actually are. Those contingent features, again, being the constants of physics, which have very idiosyncratic and precise values.
Now, look, we can continue to tease this out, the probability issue, or we can perhaps accept you're not going to come to agreement on whether there is a legitimate sort of probability issue with the fine-tuning, but we might at least accept that there's an interesting feature of our universe.
Can we just accept that there's a debate about this? Because it's often presented as if it's a fact. Fine-tuning is the fact of fine-tuning. We often hear this, the fact of fine-tuning, right? Or the discovery of fine-tuning. And what I think we can at least concede, there's a debate about whether you can even talk about the probabilities for a universe if there's only one universe, right? There's at least a debate to be had about this. It is not an established fact.
Well,
yeah, I don't concede that. I think that there's been very good work on this normalizability problem that shows that it is possible to render very meaningful probabilistic measures of the fine-tuning parameters.
Well, I'm going to accept that
but we can agree to disagree.
We're going to agree to disagree there.
And I also do agree that there is a debate,
okay.
but I think
we can find some agreement, right? There's a debate to be had.
Let's look at some of those other possibilities. I mean, although it wasn't...
Can we talk multiverse?
Well, yeah, I was going to say, although it wasn't the highest on your survey, the solution to the fine-tuning that is most frequently given is the concept of the multiverse.
Yeah, the highest on the survey was the non-explanation explanation. The multiverse is the highest as the alternative explanation.
Yeah, the multiverse one assumes that there's something to be explained.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
Yeah. So, I mean, maybe I could have a go at roughly, explain what this one is.
Give us both a break. Yeah.
Exactly. Look, there is a mechanism. I think inflation is often the one that's given at one level, though there's this kind of string theory version of it as well, that one of that hypothetically could allow for the creation of many universes. And if all of these, potentially infinite number of universes all have a different set of variables or constants, and then yes, your lottery analogy, although it's very improbable that any single one will be the winning ticket, there will be more than likely one among all those, and we happen to be in one of those unusual universes that does give rise to life because it happens to have been sort of spawned with just the right numbers to allow for it to happen. This is the multiverse hypothesis. Why don't we start with you, Phil, on this one, giving us what you understand to be some of the best evidence that this could be a valid interpretation of the fine-tuning of the universe that doesn't necessarily have to invoke God.
What I don't believe in any of these explanations. I think
you've said that you're agnostic,
right?
On these.
So I think there's a mystery. Okay. It's not even clear there's a problem to be solved, but there might be, right? There's a debate about that. Right. Oh, okay. Now, my broader view is that whatever theory we come up with, I think it would be really good if it had predictions that can be confirmed. Okay. Now, I think necessity arguably has some potential predictions. That is that the constant nature, well, if they're necessary, they couldn't take on different values, right? So we should never observe them taking on different values. And indeed, that's exactly what we see. Now, that's weak evidence because, in the high energy physics, it could be different. So it's not brilliant evidence, but it's some evidence, right? The Darwinian selection, that's in some sense a multiverse, but it's not anthropic selection in a multiverse, okay? So yeah, again, is there some evidence for that? Again, in terms of predictions, again, very weak, very circumstantial, but there's a quantum gravity theory called causal set theory. And causal set theory seems to be there's been some work sort of connecting causal set theory to this Darwinian model, okay? And causal set theory predicted that the cosmological constant would have the value that it does. And it did that 10 years before it was observed. So that gives it a boost. Far from certain, this is very much work in progress, very tentative, but it's better than nothing, okay? Now, coming on to the anthropic selection in the multiverse, one of the reasons why I don't believe causal set theory, because, hey, it did make this prediction in fact, in causal set theory, it's not a cosmological constant, it should vary over time, but it had the value that we observed. Now, another theory that predicted the cosmological constant before it was observed was the multiverse. So Steven Weinberg basically assumed there's something like a multiverse, and he said, well, now it's important to point out what we mean when we say the cosmological constant is fine-tuned. What did you say, 90?
10 to the 90th is, the figure I get from a variety of physicists.
Yeah, I mean, it varies.
Some high, 10 to the 120.
Some go up to 10 to the 120,
yeah,
in
yeah.
fact. It depends on what assumptions you have. So people aren't sure about exactly what number to put on it. What that doesn't mean is that you couldn't vary it at the 90th decimal place. That's not what it means, okay? You could actually vary it a fair bit. I think you could put the cosmological constant up by like 100 times or something like that, and nothing bad would happen. In fact, you can make it half the time smaller, nothing bad would happen. You can make it 1 billion times smaller, nothing bad would happen. You can make it 0. Most people thought it was 0, nothing bad would happen, right? The 120 comes from the prediction from quantum field theory. So quantum field theory seems to be saying the vacuum should have this enormous energy. It should be 120 orders of magnitude. So what physicists thought, would there be some sort of cancellation principle, some symmetry principle that would cancel out the contributions, the positive contributions to the vacuum, and it would cancel out to 0. Okay? And Weinberg said, you know what, maybe there's no such principle. Okay? Maybe there's just a variation. And so what would happen is we should observe a value that's compatible with our life. So it wouldn't be 0, but it would be small. It would be some small value for the cosmological constant. And again, he predicted it 10 years beforehand. Again, I don't think this is convincing because there's a lot of subtleties about this prediction. And so it's far from convincing, but at least you could say it's not nothing. There was a prediction of the value before it was observed. Okay. Similarly, inflation, at least now, again, in our book, we talk about inflation. There's a lot of claims and counterclaims. But if I was going to put my inflation hat on and argue for the multiverse, I want to be really clear.
Inflationary Phil.
Right. I want to be clear. I think there's good arguments for and against, but given the context of this question, I'm going to go with the for it. Okay. You can at least make the claim that it made predictions for experiments before they were done, and they were confirmed by experiment. Now, again, there's controversy about that, but that is actually broad consensus in the cosmological community. So, in fact, if you look at NASA's WMAP, ESA's Planck, they say we have good evidence for inflation. Now, I interviewed George Efstathiou, who was the cosmologist at Cambridge. I don't know if you know George.
I don't.
But he was the scientist chosen to present the European Space Agency's Planck spacecraft CMB data release. Okay, and I asked him, what can you say about inflation? He goes, I think there's really strong evidence for inflation, and it favors models of inflation that produce a multiverse. So I think Planck has shown evidence for a multiverse. Now, I'm not saying he's right. Okay, I think there's plenty of counters.
Saying there's an argument out there.
There's an argument out there that at least it looks better than the God one,
Okay.
because I don't think God has any claim to predictions for features of the cosmic microwave background. There's no argument for that.
It's a tentative explanation.
So it's a tentative hypothesis.
But it's better in principle than saying
it's had more success so far. Okay. There's plenty of reasons to doubt it, and I'm not saying inflation is right.
We accept all those caveats. Yeah. But in the end, whichever one you're going for, necessity, multiverse, brute fact, it sounds like from where you're standing, all of those feel like better candidates at this point than a creative intelligence beyond the cosmos who
I would
set things up so that all of those constants
and there's plenty of problems. Right. Even if you set the multiverse aside, maybe we'll get a chance to go with thinking there was an intelligent designer behind it.
Where we do need to get
so
to.
We do get
I want to make sure
even
we get
if you set all this multiverse discussion aside.
So let's talk about multiverse.
Yeah, maybe we'll just to get it out of the back and forth here. I'll just give you my take on it. Okay, all right. First of all, we have got a little bit of a difference in the level of explanation here. What you would expect from a God hypothesis or from a transcendent intelligence would be evidence of fine-tuning. We wouldn't expect to generate fine-grained predictions about cosmic
microwave background.
Cosmic microwave background radiation, CMBR. Okay, so an empirical expectation of a theistic design model would be fine-tuning, and that we find it provides confirmation of that, provided that it provides a better explanation than alternatives. Now, the main alternative is the multiverse. as an explanation, not as a non-explanation explanation. And it happens, as I mentioned, that there are two different kinds of fine-tuning. There's the fine-tuning of the initial conditions of the universe, and there's the fine-tuning of the laws and constants of the universe. And in order to explain both types of fine-tuning, multiverse advocates have proposed conjoining two different cosmological models. Now, there's a reason for that. If you have a lot of different universes out there, and they're causally disconnected from one another, then anything that happens in one universe is not going to affect what happens in another universe by definition, including whatever process it was that set the fine-tuning parameters, or what gave them their improbable values. And so for a multiverse hypothesis to work, there has to be something like an underlying common cause, a universe-generating mechanism, so you can portray the different universes as the outcome of a kind of giant lottery. And indeed, multiverse proponents have formulated two such models. One is the inflationary cosmology, and the other is a string theoretic cosmology. And it happens that the multiverse cosmology does a nice job, if true, of explaining the fine-tuning of the initial conditions of the universe, but because every bubble universe within the inflationary cosmological model that is created when you get just the right inflaton shutoff energies, since they're all governed by the same laws, then you don't get a shuffling of laws and constants. Conversely, for reasons that are much too difficult to explain, but which I do address in the book, string theory could do, in principle, a decent job of explaining the different laws and constants of physics, but not the initial conditions. So in virtue of that, the most current multiverse models conjoin those two things and give us a inflationary string or string inflationary model, okay? Now, that ends up illustrating one of the points I've been making, which is that these speculative cosmological models end up having real big problems with Occam's razor. And I want to be able to explain that first and then explain what is the even more difficult problem.
Okay, we'll let you do that and then we'll have Phil respond.
The first problem is you get this multiplication of theoretical entities. If for the string multiverse, the inflationary string multiverse, to explain the fine-tuning as well as, call it commonsensical inference to design, you have to posit an inflaton field. You have to posit the idea that the shutoff energies in the inflaton field will produce new universes. You have to posit that those shutoff energies will happen in just the right measure at just the right time within a narrow interval. Then you inherit all of the theoretical entities involved in string theory. That the fundamental units of matter are small filaments called strings. That there are multiple dimensions of unobservable dimensions of space beyond the three that we observe. There's 6 or 7, depending on whether you accept M theory or not. And you have to accept that there are things that wrap around the strings that determine laws and constants. In the book, I list what I call 10 impossible things you have to believe before breakfast. The multiplication of theoretical entities in this combo multiverse hypothesis is pretty profligate. You get what philosophers of science call bloated ontology. And so when you compare the theistic design hypothesis with the inflationary string multiverse, you've got one simple postulate which aligns with our ordinary experience of cause and effect, which is that minds generate finely tuned systems, versus an explanatory framework that requires a multiplication of very abstract theoretical postulates, and which in fact have to be conjoined. So you've got two different theoretical models that you have to accept working in tandem. That's one problem.
Sorry, that's quite a lot. Can we get a chance to reply?
You got to filibuster.
Because that's a lot there. There's like 3 different arguments.
You keep accusing me of interrupting
but
you get to filibuster and I don't.
I do want to give Steve the chance, because he obviously feels it's important just to lay out a whole case.
I have a full case.
Maybe I can borrow your pen and write this down, because honestly, there's quite a few different arguments there.
Go for it.
Okay.
All right. The second thing is that in each of these speculative cosmological models that are conjoined and postulated to explain the fine-tuning, each of these require universe-generating mechanisms that themselves have to be finely tuned. And so they take you back right to where we started, which is unexplained fine-tuning. So I'm actually sympathetic to what Phil said. Maybe there is a multiverse. I don't know. But the existence of a multiverse would not refute the design argument. Rather, it would underscore it at a different level. And that the multiverse advocates can't explain fine-tuning without invoking prior fine-tuning. For example, in the inflationary model, the inflaton shutoff energies have to be extremely finely tuned, and the interval in which they occur has to be extremely finely tuned. In string theory, there's a whole lot of implicit fine-tuning, a little more difficult to explain because string theory is just very much more difficult to explain. But you've got this unexplained fine-tuning in both models, suggesting even if the multiverse is true, you still need intelligent design.
Okay, so those are the two, possibly three different things.
I think it's got like six.
Okay, so there's quite a few different things there.
Well, two basic critiques, that it's a bloated ontology.
Bloated ontology.
Violating Occam's razor.
Yeah.
Not a simpler explanation than theistic design, and not an adequate explanation because there's no ultimate explanation for fine-tuning within the multiverse framework.
Yeah, and that requires further fine-tuning in order to justify itself. Okay, where do you want to begin?
Okay, I don't know. Okay, so first off, Stephen said that you need an inflaton field. Not true. It's generally modeled as having an inflaton field, true, but it's not true that you have to have it. There are versions of inflation.
Fair enough, but
no, but this is important because the whole point is, you have to fine-tune the parameters of the inflaton field, okay? But there are versions of inflation that don't require. There was a new one published very recently, actually, where you don't even have an inflaton field. There are others that don't require an inflaton field. So maybe what this is telling you is that inflation is incomplete, right? And there are other versions that maybe are better, okay? So no doubt that inflation is an incomplete theory. I don't doubt that for a second, right? But so what? All right, we progress in science, okay? So now it says that inflation requires fine-tuning. That is cherry-picking the literature, I'm afraid, because there are certainly papers that say that inflation requires fine-tuning, and there are others that say no, inflation is generic. So yes, you can quote the papers that say inflation requires fine-tuning, and lots of people in this game do that, and they forget the papers that say actually inflation can be quite generic. It often depends on what you think happens before inflation. So for example, as I said before, you could have a bouncing cosmology, and in some of those models, the bounce is seen as an alternative to inflation, but in others, you have a bounce and inflation. Okay, and in there, the idea has been claimed that they actually set up the conditions for inflation, and inflation is not fine-tuned, right? So again, there's so much more uncertainty about this. So he says, this requires fine-tuning. That's too quick, right? Okay. Now he talks about string theory, and you need all these assumptions. Okay, I personally think that you don't really need this, right? Because I think the advocate of the fine-tuning argument has to presume that the constants could be different. So if you look at, let's say when William Lane Craig presented the fine-tuning argument, he did it as a deductive argument. He said, it's either chance, necessity, or design. How did he rule out necessity? He appealed to the string theory landscape. He said, well, look, in string theory, you've got all these different solutions to how the compactification of the extra dimensions happens, and that gives you different constant nature. So the constant nature are not necessary, right? But if we deny that, if we say, okay, I'm not going to believe in string theory, okay? But now what's the...
You open the possibility of them being necessary.
Exactly.
Right.
Necessity just comes straight back in again, right? So it's the fine-tuning advocate that needs to say that the constants could easily be different. Because if they couldn't easily be different, if you've got lots and lots of universes, like say in the inflationary multiverse, and they all have the same constants, I'm going to say, maybe the constants aren't that unlikely, right? Maybe the necessary guys are right? So I think you don't need any of this string theory stuff, but even if you did, right? Again, string theory, it does need assumptions, true, but it also gives you a lot, right? So when we think about what theories are plausible, yes, when they have assumptions, that's a cost against the theory, true. But you have to weigh the costs versus the benefits. And string theory does a lot, right? It gives you finite solutions. It gives you a unified theory of all forces. It gives you quantum gravity. Holography came out of string theory. So you have to try and weigh up the costs versus the benefits. Now, a very important point. Stephen says that God is a simple hypothesis because it just assumes one thing, God, right? That is, I think, a totally wrong way to think about the cost of assumptions. You don't measure the cost of assumptions by just how many assumptions you have to make. You have to weigh them by their plausibility. So let's think of, let's say, one of my favorite magicians is David Blaine. And he does these fantastic tricks. He made the Statue of Liberty disappear. He walked through the Wall of China. He flew around like a sports arena, a beautiful illusion. Now, I could say, all right, well, I think the Statue of Liberty one was done by a rotating platform. I think the flying one was done by, invisible wires, and they must have had some other mechanisms. And, other illusions were done with mirrors. And I could list all the assumptions I need, and there could be a long list. Alternatively, I could say, no.
Magic exists?
It's just magic.
Okay.
That's one assumption. Now, which do you think is simpler?
Yeah, arguably the magic one is a simple explanation.
No, it's not, because it's the number of assumptions.
But that's what I'm saying. Right. I assumed you were going to say it's not helpful because it's the plausibility.
It's not even simpler because we're not judging simplicity by number of assumptions. You have to weight them by how plausible they are.
Exactly.
So if you have a whole bunch of assumptions, but each one has a higher degree of plausibility, then actually they don't come up to very much, right? So inflationary cosmology, if you ask most cosmologists, is pretty damn plausible, right? Same with string theory in the world of quantum gravity. So whereas God is an immaterial mind that can change the constants of nature. Where's the evidence that there's an immaterial mind that can change the constants of nature?
Really helpfully brings us into land on this.
I'm not questioning the plausibility
question
of those theories, although many physicists do. I'm questioning the efficacy of those theories as ultimate explanations for fine-tuning, which is a completely different matter. And notice that Phil did not say that these alternative versions of inflation don't require fine-tuning to produce new universes. And all the models that all the cosmological models that purport to explain the proliferation of new universes do require prior fine-tuning. And that's the unexplained thing that theism explains, that the models themselves can't explain, because that's a brute fact of the models themselves.
Okay. Just respond, and we will start to bring this into land now, on this fundamental question, which we've sort of circled around at various points across the past 2 hours, which is Phil's ultimate sense that not only does he feel there are other models, you don't have to go to a beginning, you don't have to necessarily see fine-tuning as fine-tuned, but he also simply lands on the fact that God is not a good explanation in and of itself. God doesn't give you a testable hypothesis. God doesn't give you, and fundamentally, I think that's probably in the end why a lot of people on his surveys sort of relegate intelligent design, because it doesn't feel like a plausible sort of hypothesis that raises to the level of a scientific one, and so on. But
Phil said something very important. He didn't use the term background knowledge, but he said we have to have hypotheses that are consistent with the things so it's not just the multiplication of hypotheses that might make something parsimonious. It's the multiplication of hypotheses that are not consistent with our background knowledge. Okay, one of the most important pieces of background knowledge that we have is our knowledge of what agents do that no thing else does. And one of the things that agents do is they generate functional information. They also generate finely tuned systems. And so the hypothesis of a pre-existing mind is not only simpler in the sense that it doesn't multiply theoretical entities, it's also simpler in the sense that it posits an entity which is known to have the kind of powers that are needed to explain the effect in question. And I think this is where I think the presumption among many scientists that they must limit themselves to materialistic explanation, which has been deeply embedded in the community over the last 150 years, actually blinds people to what's going on around us all the time, that minds have unique causal powers that brute matter doesn't have. And what I see in the cosmological discussion, broad strokes, is that whether we're talking about the origin of the universe or even about the fine-tuning, invariably people recognize something separate from these phenomena are necessary to explain them. But when the explanations are confined to materialistic processes, fields, forces, they might do a nice job of suggesting an entity outside of the thing that needs to be explained. But because our universe has very specific features that, yes, could be otherwise, that specificity requires mind-like properties as a condition of explanation. And so I think that the naturalist has both a something from nothing problem when we're talking about the universe, but also a no free lunch problem. In that fine-tuning or information density, these are things we know from experience come from minds. And when we find them in the universe or in life, in systems that we know we did not generate, it is a logical and natural inference based on our background knowledge of the unique properties that agents have to infer agency was at work.
Okay, this kind of shifts us into the more metaphysical question of the nature of the explanation. And yeah, Steve says in life we always are assuming that a mind generates, complexity and effects and things. Why shouldn't we apply the same logic to the complexity of the universe that we find ourselves in and the fact that it is here in the first place? I mean, without going back over some of the physical explanations we've already spent time debating, like what's your response to the this I suppose more simple idea that a mind is a plausible way of understanding where all this came from?
Right. Okay. So minds, I don't think, are the only way to get complexity. So I think that's just false. You can get complexity in the natural world, but let's just agree that it is, right? Okay. For the sake of argument, they always come from physical minds. Right? The information in the mind has to be stored somewhere, and this is stored physically. But that's not what Stephen's suggesting. He's suggesting an immaterial mind, and that doesn't comport with our experience. So minds that we know that can do physics, right? They have physical bodies, even if you believe in dualism. Like, let's not deny dualism. But when they do their design work, they're attached to bodies. So even if you think they're immaterial minds, what our experience is, they always are attached to bodies when they do their design work. They always need an energy source. They're always localized in space, right? And in fact, when we look at the conditions of the early universe, the hot Big Bang, it doesn't look like any mind that we know of could exist there. So there's only two explanations. Either you say minds couldn't exist there, so the explanation that we're looking for is not mind, or you have to say it's some very, very different type of mind to anything that we know. But then you're not appealing to, the everyday world that we know. I'm appealing to what we know.
That's really helpful, right? And it's concise.
Now, I think there's a potential. I just want to address one or 2 points, and then I want to get to a big contradiction. He said, theism. I asked for the predictions. What are the predictions of theism? He said fine-tuning was the prediction. I don't think that's right. First off, as a matter of history, I don't think theologians, maybe you'll correct me if I'm wrong here, I don't know if theologians are saying we're going to find out that the cosmological constant was fine-tuned. Right? I mean, I can imagine, I don't think that is a prediction of theism. And in fact, I can imagine we found the opposite. Suppose we find the opposite, that the constant nature could take on any value at all, right? I can imagine the theist saying, wow, that's incredible, isn't it? Because God, surely he loves life. So he would set the probability of life to be really high.
So you're just moving the goalposts depending on
it's a
Texas whatever
sharpshooter fallacy. Okay. You're seeing where the bullet landed, and you're drawing a bullseye around it, and you're saying, aha, that's what God would have wanted. And if you've got the opposite, and in fact, there are cases that's opposite, right? In fact, the so-called fine-tuning of the entropy, now that is fine-tuned in the sense that if you just selected it randomly, it's fine-tuned, but it's not fine-tuned for life. You could have the entropy enormously, enormously higher, and life would still exist. Bet you the theist isn't going to say, well, that's evidence against God. We were predicting that it should have this tiny narrow range, but it doesn't. No one's going to say that. Now, I think there's a sort of possibly a contradiction, at least a tension in the fine-tuning argument here, with this appeal to an immaterial mind. Because, let me put it in the form of a dilemma, all right? A, minds can exist without brains. If that's true, right, then the fine-tuning doesn't matter, does it? Like, who cares what the value of the cosmological constant is? That just means you couldn't have a material mind. But hey, minds can exist without matter. So minds can still exist. Okay. So it seems like fine-tuning, if you take that option, minds can exist without matter, then it seems like the fine-tuning doesn't matter at all.
It's irrelevant to the question.
God can make electrons have mental lives. I mean, often like someone like a theologian like Richard Swinburne will say, what's important is that it's the mental property, the moral property. But hey, theism believes in spirits that rebelled against God, like the devil or his minions, right? So it doesn't follow that if you take this view, minds don't have to be material, then it seems like fine-tuning doesn't matter. Now, the alternative is say, okay, minds have to be material. You have to have material bodies to have moral worth, all right? But if that's true, a lot of Christian theology is wrong, right?
Okay.
Because...
Well, let's see how Steve responds to
okay,
that.
and then I've got one more argument I want to push.
Okay,
so
we may be getting to the limits of a discussion like this, because there's so many different things that are being thrown out.
I accept you're not going to be able to respond to everything that Phil's just raised.
I'd be happy to respond, though. It's a couple things. Okay, first of all, there's a great deal of literature in the philosophy of science about the testability of hypotheses, whether they be metaphysical hypotheses or scientific hypotheses. And it turns out that prediction is a special case of empirical expectation. So I've often used the Dawkins quote I shared before because I really like it. He was here yesterday. I didn't get to talk to him, but he says that the universe we observe has precisely the properties that we should expect. Okay, that we can often test theories not only by what they predict, but also by what they explain. And if a theory has explanatory power that another theory lacks, that counts in its favor as much as a prediction can count in its favor. So no, it's probably not the case that theologians in advance predicted the fine-tuning, but fine-tuning is the kind of thing you would expect from the activity of a mind, where it's not the kind of thing that you would expect from brute matter. Secondly, as to the immateriality of the mind, there's a principle in all historical scientific research called the vera causa principle. It also works in physics as well. It's the idea that we should explain things by reference to causes that we know are in operation, or by reference to causes that have relevantly similar properties to those that we know are in operation. For example, Darwin used natural selection to explain the variation and the generation of new biological form by an analogy to what human breeders could do. So he extended known experience of cause and effect by saying that my mechanism of natural selection is relevantly similar, and so that allows me to extrapolate to explain something I haven't to explain something that I've never seen produced in nature, but because I've seen something relevantly similar, this is a reasonable postulate. It's a completely reasonable postulate to say, if we're talking about the origin of the fine-tuning of the universe itself, and if we know that fine-tuning is always produced by a mind, that a mind was at work. What kind of mind? No, not a terrestrial mind, not a mind that's embodied in a physical substrate, but perhaps a mind that is transcendent in the sense that Judeo-Christian theology affirms of God. So that is again an appropriate extrapolation from a causal power that we know from experience, and that type of move is made in explanation by materialists and theists alike. There are deep questions about the nature of mind and the way in which different models of mind might relate to the whole program of intelligent design. I've written on that. I am a mind-body dualist. I know that Phil went hammer and tongs recently with Alex O'Connor over this very question. Fair enough.
Oh, no, that was about panpsychism.
That was panpsychism. That's
a different issue.
No, I understand,
issue.
but he's not a strict. Okay. He doesn't hold an epiphenomenal view or emergent mind, and so I mean these are really deep questions in the philosophy of mind, and I think we're going to...
Yeah, that would take us into a whole different realm.
I have written on this. I think our view is completely coherent, and I think the fine-tuning argument, because it's based on our knowledge of cause and effect and a relevant extrapolation from that knowledge, I think it makes perfect sense to say that the fine-tuning that we see at the foundation of the universe that's necessary to life was produced by a mind that transcends the universe.
Okay, I can see you're scribbling some responses, but I'm aware we've been going for getting on for 3 hours now. So
very quick.
You may happily have the last word.
If it's the last word, and then
thank
it
you,
won't
Steve.
be the entire last word, because we'll have one more
Thank you.
attempt to kind of seeing where we got
I just
to.
realized I didn't eat very much at lunch, and I'm too.
There's snacks outside.
I do believe in certain material things. Like,
Okay. So first off, we appeal to causes in operation today to infer the past. Yes, if we think those causes were present in the past. So for example, if I look at the extinction of the dodo, that was hunted to extinction. Humans are the cause. Same with many other species of animals. Humans did it. But if I want to look at the extinction of the dinosaurs, I'm not going to appeal to humans because humans weren't around.
Okay.
So similarly,
obviously.
Right. So similarly, I don't think minds can be around in the early universe because the very reasons that you think life couldn't be around is the very reasons that I think minds couldn't be around. So basically, I'm going to throw the fine-tuning back in your face, basically. Now, can God explain it? Well, God can do anything. So yes, he can explain it, but at a cost of he can do anything. To me, now this is probably where the difference is. He thinks that's low cost. I think that's maximum cost. So yes, you can have it explain stuff, but the cost is too high. So I just don't buy this, all right? Now, you don't just get an explanation for the fine-tuning by positing a mind. You have to have a mind with intentions. You have to do something called divine psychology, right? You have to say, well, God is good, and so God would fine-tune the constants. If you don't think those are true, then this argument's not going to work. And I think we've got really good reasons to think it's not true, because I think that the God of the Bible is not good. He commands genocide. He commands slaughtering of animals.
That's opening up a whole new can of worms.
Yeah, but this is what these arguments relate to each other, because if you can predict what a good God would do, then basically you shouldn't observe a world full of suffering. So either you say, I can't predict what God would do, in which case take the fine-tuning argument away. And indeed, there have been Christians who basically advocate something called skeptical theism that says we're going to explain the problem of evil by saying we don't know what a world God would actually make. You're not epistemically justified in predicting the world that would come about by a good God. And they say, these are Christian philosophers, Hudson's a good example, we shouldn't be using the fine-tuning argument. So I know I'm not going to convince every Christian here, but they should be aware that if they're using the skeptical theism defense for fine-tuning, then they're in trouble, okay? Now, the other part, so I think there's good evidence then against this mind explanation for fine-tuning because it requires God to be good, and the evidence is against that. I don't think we have strong evidence against the multiverse. We don't have strong evidence against a necessary hypothesis. We don't have strong evidence against a black hole one, but we do have good evidence against the God one because it requires, at least the way it's normally formulated, God to be good. And then the very last thing I'll say is it assumes that it's a good thing to create a physical universe. But there were Christians who thought actually it was a bad thing to make the physical universe because there were these guys called the Gnostics, and they thought the creation of the physical universe was done by an evil demiurge. Okay, and so that challenges the notion that it's a good thing to make a physical universe. They thought we should be spirits. We shouldn't expect a universe with life.
This takes us into interesting theological territory, scriptural territory, all kinds of territory that we're sadly out of time to be able to explore today. So who knows, perhaps we can do another 2 to 3 hour kind of debate on these issues. But we will leave it there. All I will ask is just, well, first of all, I say, thank you both. This has not only been a battle of minds, but just of stamina. We've been going, for the best part of 3 hours at this point, and so well done all round for an incredible display on that front. We've talked about science and faith. Is there a conflict? The origins of the scientific revolution. We've talked about Big Bang cosmology and your different views on whether some of the models are equally, valid or give potentially explanations versus the explanation that there is a creative intelligence behind it. Likewise with the fine-tuning, we've been, going back and forth on whether there is fine-tuning, whether that fine-tuning could potentially be explained by a multiverse or whether God is a satisfactory explanation. Okay, so as we bring this into land, accepting that neither of you have convinced the other person, we never expected that to happen. Is there anything that your counterpart has said today that you found helpful, clarifying, something that you might take away and say, actually, that's been somewhat helpful and it is something that I'll factor into my future thinking around this? I'll start with you, Phil, and then come to you, Steve.
Well, first of all, I just want to compliment Stephen because I think this is the toughest debate I've ever had. All right. So I think he did a great job So I want to compliment him. I think he's done his homework.
You're very good too.
Thank you so much.
And it's fun, right?
Yeah, it's fun. It is fun, right? So first takeaway is that this was fun.
Good.
Right?
I'm glad
and
to
I
hear.
think, yes, so I think Stephen makes very interesting points, and I think him appealing to whether theories need their own fine-tunings is something you do need to think about. Obviously, I draw a different conclusion from him, but I think we do need to think, because actually some atheists think, well, we've got the final answers from certain speculative theories. And I think Stephen's right to say, no, you have to look behind them. What's going on behind them? What are the metaphysical assumptions behind them? So I think that is a very interesting point. And that's something to think about for sure.
All right.
Well, maybe not exactly on your point, but I'm very impressed with the depth of Phil's knowledge of physics. It's commendable. And it reinforces the compliment I meant to give at the beginning of the conversation. I don't know if I remember to, but I really appreciated the book. I think you and Ash, did I get it right? Finally, I do learn. Fine. I think you do an excellent job of exposition of the competing models that are being formulated right now. And so I highly recommend the book.
Can we hold the book up?
Yeah, let's hold it up. Get you some sales, my friend.
Let's get some sales.
Absolutely. Here we go. Battle of the Big Bang.
Yeah.
That's the book.
There's a couple of things you mentioned that I'm going to need to go and just bone up on, get back into. I remember writing about loop quantum gravity and some of as it pertains, kind of rusty on that right now. So I'll just be honest about that and some of your points there. I guess I just appreciate the intensity of your interest in these deep questions. And I've always felt I had one of my first debates was, it wasn't really a debate, it was an academic conference, but I was posed opposite Michael Ruse, who's a philosopher of biology, British, and he had been proposed as one of the examiners for my PhD thesis because I challenged his model of explanation in the thesis, and the examiners thought it would be fun to have a spirited debate at the examination. And Michael sadly passed away last fall, and so I can tell this story now. But my wife said, "Well, wouldn't it be better to have that debate after you've passed?" and so a different examiner was chosen. But within 6 months of passing, we were at a conference together, and we had he gave his view of a lot of it had to do with biological origins, but the underlying philosophy of explanation you would use to adjudicate competing models. It was really a very good. But my work for my thesis was directly pointed at his model, so I kind of let him have it. And afterwards, he was so gracious and took me aside and he said, "Hey, well, don't take this too seriously. Some of this I developed for rhetorical purposes because of those young Earth creationists. And here's what I really think." But then he said, "Look, I'd like to help you, get on in the field. You've got some promise. I'd like to help you. I have lots of connections." And he befriended me, even though we were on completely opposite sides of the discussion, and remained so for 30 years. And we had a conversation like this on a program in Washington, D.C. called Think Tank that was just fantastic. And we were on, so I've always felt that anyone who has a deep interest in these questions, on whatever, irrespective of what side they fall, is someone that I feel a deep kinship to. And so we got spirited and feisty a few times, but I really enjoyed this. I think you're very skilled as a debater, but you clearly know the physics very well. And so that makes this, I think, I'd hoped we would break some new ground in a cosmological discussion. I think that happens today.
I think we have.
And
I think it's
you're a great
Yeah.
credit to that result.
Wonderful.
Justin,
Thank you
it's been
both.
great.
Thank you both. And just a reminder, we'll make sure there are links to this from the show. But Battle of the Big Bang, Phil Halper and Niayesh Afshordi, and Return of the God Hypothesis is Stephen C. Meyer's book. Thank you, gentlemen, both for joining me on Uncommon Ground.
It's been brilliant. Thank you.
We did it. Yeah.